The street is silent because it has been silent for nearly 2,000 years. A shallow stone curb runs beside a paved road worn smooth by feet, sandals, cartwheels, rainwater, and ordinary impatience. A doorway opens onto a room where no one has crossed the threshold since the day the city stopped being a city. On one wall, pigment still clings to plaster. On the floor, a jar lies tipped on its side. There is no grand monument announcing what happened here. No single object large enough to carry the weight of an entire vanished world. Instead, there are fragments the hollow shape of a wooden shutter, long since rotted away. A cooking vessel, where a meal was never finished. A set of steps leading nowhere, because the upper floor collapsed under the burden of debris. Above it all, where daylight once entered freely, there was for centuries only darkness, pressure, mineral dust, and the slow patience of the earth. The city did not merely fall, it was covered, sealed away from memory until someone, long afterward, drove a spade into ground that appeared empty and struck the edge of a buried wall. There is something uniquely unsettling about a buried city. Ruins standing in open air can seem almost prepared for their own decay columns leaning under the sky. Walls softened by weather, foundations fading into grass. They wear time openly. But a buried city feels interrupted. Its disappearance has the shape of an unfinished act. Streets continue beneath fields. Homes remain stacked below vineyards, dunes, marshes, forests, modern houses, even highways. The world above moves on, sometimes without knowing that another world lies directly underneath it, still holding courtyards, drains, shrines, ovens, storage rooms, workshops, painted chambers, broken toys, animal bones, fingerprints pressed into clay, and the unmistakable evidence that people once believed tomorrow would resemble today. They repaired roofs, they stored grain, they scratched jokes and insults onto walls, they fastened doors at night, then ash descended, or river mud spread across foundations. Or sand migrated over abandoned streets, or the sea rose through a harbour district, or conquerors burned what they could and left collapsing masonry to be buried beneath later lives. No single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of ancient cities, because cities are buried in many different ways, and often the final layer of soil hides a much longer story of risk, endurance, failure, and forgetting. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the most haunting part of these lost cities is not that they vanished completely, it is that so much remained, close enough to touch, while generation after generation passed over them without hearing anything from below. In some places the burial is violent and almost unimaginably fast. A mountain splits open in fire within hours, roofs sag beneath falling ash, streets turn into channels of choking debris, and heat races through rooms still holding beds, lamps, and food containers. When archaeologists return centuries later, the city may appear to have been arrested in its final moments, but even such extraordinary preservation is deceptive. A sealed room is not a complete life. An abandoned vessel does not explain who carried it, or what that person feared when the light disappeared. Catastrophe preserves objects unevenly, and erases people unevenly too. Wood burns or decays, cloth disappears, voices vanish entirely, the evidence remains incomplete, however powerfully the buried architecture seems to speak. Elsewhere, there is no single terrible day. The burial happens by degrees, quietly enough that those living through it may not recognize an ending. A river changes course and canals begin to dry. Floodwater repeatedly leaves silt across alleys until repairs become harder than abandonment. Crops fail beyond the walls. Trade caravans choose safer roads. Wells become brackish. Families leave one neighbourhood, then another. Roof beams are removed for use elsewhere. Doors are carried away. Stones from temples become foundations for smaller settlements nearby. A city once loud with bargaining, ceremony, animals, smoke, and labour slowly becomes an exposed skeleton. Then vegetation closes over it, or desert sand begins to collect against the lee side of its walls, or seasonal floods soften brick into shapeless mounds. A few generations later, the city may survive only as a name in a tale, a ridge in a field, a strange cluster of stones, or a local warning not to dig too deeply in a particular place. This is one of the strange truths of ancient urban life. A city can be both enormous and surprisingly easy to lose. Modern eyes are accustomed to concrete, steel, maps, aerial photographs, property records, and networks that keep places fixed in public knowledge. Ancient cities often depended on materials that surrendered quickly once maintenance ended. Mud brick, among the most common building materials in early cities, is strong when protected, repaired, and plastered. But abandoned mud brick gradually melts back into the landscape. Walls collapse into low hills. Rooms fill with their own disintegrating roofs. Wind-blown dust settles into corners and seals floors beneath new layers. A metropolis can eventually resemble a natural mound. In the Near East, many such mounds are known as Tell's artificial hills created by repeated building, demolition, collapse, abandonment, and rebuilding. One human world stacked upon another. Beneath an apparently ordinary rise in the ground may lie thousands of years of doors, hearths, walls, graves, fires, and forgotten decisions. At other sites, the landscape does not disguise the city by smoothing it down, but by overwhelming it. Forests are especially convincing accomplices in disappearance. Trees root themselves inside temples. Rain loosens joints between stones. Vines descend over stairs and terraces. Seedlings become trunks, their roots levering apart structures built to project permanence. From a distance, the city becomes green relief, an unevenness in the canopy, for centuries. Outsiders could move near ancient urban centres without fully comprehending their scale. A wall glimpsed through leaves might be dismissed as an isolated ruin rather than the edge of an immense planned landscape. Only patient survey, local knowledge from excavation, and, in recent years, technologies able to see patterns beneath vegetation have begun to reveal that some apparently empty forests once contained roads, reservoirs, neighbourhoods, embankments, agricultural fields, sacred centres, and populations whose presence dramatically altered the land. Sand performs a different kind of erasure. It does not need to destroy walls to make them disappear. In dry regions, once the water source fails or the roads of commerce move elsewhere, wind can carry the surface of the desert steadily into the abandoned city. Sand fills doorways, presses into storage buildings, levels streets, and climbs the sides of towers under the right conditions. It can also protect wood, woven material, documents. And even food residues may survive an arid burial that would vanish almost anywhere else. The desert that seems to have swallowed a settlement may have held parts of it with extraordinary care. A scrap of writing recovered from dry ruins can expose details more intimate than a king's inscription accounts of supplies, letters between officials, worries about security, records of taxation. Traces of people still managing ordinary problems while the environment and economy around them were already changing. Water buries more completely still. Along coasts and river deltas, a city may sink without going anywhere at all. Ground saturated with water compresses, earthquakes liquefy unstable soils, harbours subside, storms remove protective land. Sea level changes turn docks into submerged foundations and streets into underwater corridors. The city's stones remain where builders laid them, yet fish pass through what were once public spaces. Statues fall face down into silt. Ships settle beside quays that no longer meet the air. Layers of mud close over markets, anchors, ritual offerings, pottery, columns, and collapsed buildings, preserving them in a realm that is difficult to reach and still more difficult to interpret. When divers or underwater archaeologists finally enter such places, they do not discover a neat drowned tableau. They work through darkness, currents, shifting sediment, damaged contexts. And the problem that an object found underwater may have been moved long after the city began to fail. What survives in the record suggests catastrophe in some drowned cities and gradual instability in others. In many cases, scholars still debate the precise order in which land, water, buildings, and people surrendered ground. Then there are cities buried by later cities. This may be the most common form of disappearance and the least dramatic, because people are exceptionally efficient at building over the past when it lies in a useful location. An ancient street becomes a foundation trench, a sacred precinct becomes a quarry. Broken columns are fitted into newer walls, drainage channels are reused, forgotten, rediscovered, and covered again. Generations may occupy the same favourable rise above a river. The same defensible hill, the same harbour edge or crossing point, each leaving layers pressed down upon those before. In living cities across the world, workers opening a utility trench or digging foundations sometimes encounter masonry, burials, mosaics, wells, roads, or artefacts belonging to a place the modern city has not destroyed so much as absorbed. The buried ancient city is not always out in a lonely desert or abandoned beneath trees. Sometimes it is beneath a cafe, a market, a railway platform, an apartment block, or a pavement crossed daily by people who unknowingly follow the alignment of a road first laid out centuries before their language existed. Every burial transforms the city into a puzzle. Archaeology is often imagined as a process of uncovering what happened, as though soil were a curtain and the truth simply waited behind it. But burial protects and distorts at the same time. Heavy layers crush roofs. Water carries objects from one room to another. Survivors remove valuables before leaving. Later scavengers take dressed stone and metal fittings. Animals burrow through deposits. Plants break walls. Ancient excavators dig into still earlier ancient layers. Even a city sealed by sudden disaster is not a perfect photograph of a day in the past. It is a damaged archive shaped by panic, destruction, chemistry, accident, and the uneven chances of survival. The objects that remain are not always the objects that mattered most. Gold may be taken away, while a charred loaf survives. A ruler's palace may be quarried to its foundations, while a poor family's cooking area remains sealed under rubble. A written archive may dissolve in damp earth, leaving historians to reconstruct an entire society from drains, rubbish heaps, bones, pottery fragments, and the wear marks on stone steps. And yet, those humble traces are often the reason a buried city feels so close. Monumental ruins tell us that power once stood there. Buried rooms tell us that people did. A doorway polished by repeated hands, a threshold repaired with a slightly different stone, seeds carbonized in a storage jar, a workshop floor blackened by years of craft, a small object dropped behind a wall and never retrieved. These are not simply relics of disappearance. They are evidence of attachment, repetition, work. Hunger, faith, status, boredom, worry, pride, and the countless acts required to keep urban life functioning. The vanished city is never just its last disaster. Long before it was buried, it had to be made, supplied, governed, defended, cleaned, repaired, argued over, celebrated, and believed in. That is where the deeper mystery begins. People did not usually build cities in safe emptiness. They built where the land offered abundance and danger to gather rich volcanic soils beneath smoking mountains, fertile floodplains beside rivers capable of tearing through settlements, ports exposed to unstable coasts, oases dependent on fragile channels of water, valleys linked to trade but vulnerable to invasion, forests capable of feeding dense populations until climate and politics strained the system beyond endurance. The same forces that nourished a city could eventually conceal it. Ash that ruined homes could preserve their painted walls. Rivers that carried grain could bury streets in silt. Seas that opened routes to distant wealth could rise through harbour buildings. Sand that made travel and farming impossible could shield letters, fabrics, and timber from decay. Destruction and preservation are not opposites in these landscapes. Very often, they arrive together. At the edge of the trench, the archaeologist brushes away the last thin layer covering a threshold. For the first time in centuries, light reaches the stone. It reveals no complete answer, only an entrance. Behind it lies a city in fragments, and beyond that city lie others, some silenced in a single afternoon, some abandoned slowly enough that no one living there ever saw the moment of disappearance, some drowned, some burned, some overtaken by roots, some still concealed beneath modern life. Their streets are buried, but the choices that place them there are not entirely foreign. Every city is a wager placed against landscape, weather, violence, scarcity, and time. Ancient people made that wager with courage, necessity, calculation, and sometimes fatal confidence. To understand how their cities vanished, it is first necessary to understand why anyone built them in such dangerous places at all. A city rarely begins with walls. It begins with a reason to remain. A river bends through a plain and leaves behind dark soil that can be planted again and again. A spring rises in a dry landscape where every drinkable pool is a promise. A bay opens toward distant shores, sheltered enough for boats to anchor and broad enough for strangers to arrive bearing timber, metal, salt, wine, grain, obsidian, ivory, stories, and disease. A volcanic slope, alarming to anyone who sees smoke above it. Produces fields so fertile that vines and orchards flourish almost unnaturally well. A narrow crossing between mountains draws travellers into one unavoidable route. People stop there first for a season, then for a generation, then long enough that storage pits deepen, houses cluster, shrines acquire offerings, disputes require rules, and pathways harden into streets. What later generations call an ancient city is often the accumulated result of countless practical decisions made by people who did not think they were moving toward catastrophe. They were moving toward food, water, trade, protection, family, and opportunity. Danger stood beside all of those things, but it did not always seem like the most important fact. This is why buried cities appear so frequently in places that, from a distance, seem reckless. The ancient world did not allow most communities the luxury of choosing between safe land and profitable land. Often the safest land was too poor, too dry, too remote, or too difficult to defend. Fertile ground lay where rivers flooded. Reliable shipping depended on coasts vulnerable to storms, earthquakes, and subsidence. Mineral wealth drew workers into unstable valleys and contested frontiers. Agricultural abundance spread across volcanic landscapes precisely because earlier eruptions had made the soil rich. A community facing hunger in a secure place might reasonably decide that living under a dangerous mountain was not madness but survival. Catastrophe is obvious after it happens. Before it happens, a green field, a full granary, a crowded harbour, and a flowing canal can make a hazardous place seem blessed. The great river valleys show this bargain in its most ancient and powerful form. In Mesopotamia, where some of the world's earliest cities rose, water was never simply present in the right amount. The Tigris and Euphrates could support astonishing agricultural production, but their behaviour was unpredictable and often destructive. Communities learned to divert water, channel it, contain it, distribute it, and argue over it. Irrigation allowed cereal crops to support growing populations. Specialists, temple institutions, administrators, traders, builders, potters, metal workers, and soldiers. The city became possible because water could be organised. Yet every channel also created dependence. Canals silted up, levees failed, upstream choices harmed downstream fields, poor drainage left salts in the soil, weakening harvests across long periods. A system designed to master a difficult landscape made urban life more productive, but also more fragile if labour, authority, or climate shifted. In Egypt, the Nile offered a different rhythm, a flood more regular than many other rivers, renewing farmland with sediment and joining settlements along a great northward corridor. Its reliability helped sustain one of the longest-lived civilizations in human history, but even here water carried risk. Floods could be too low, leaving hunger behind them, or too high, damaging settlements and stores. Cities and administrative centres clustered where access to river transport, agricultural wealth. Sacred geography and royal control converged. The river was road, field maker, boundary, and clock. It made enormous concentrations of people and power possible, while ensuring that the life of those communities remained bound to forces beyond any ruler's command. A city near the Nile did not need to fear sudden burial in ash. but it lived in continual conversation with sediment, shifting channels, marsh expansion, drought, and flood. Entire urban landscapes in delta regions would later be transformed so thoroughly by water and mud that their original forms became difficult to recover. Far to the east, the Indus civilization developed cities whose planning still has an almost startling clarity. Streets are lined in ordered patterns, sophisticated drainage, brick construction, wells, craft areas, storage facilities, and extensive trade connections. Settlements such as Mohenjo-daro and Harappa did not rise accidentally. They emerged within river systems that provided agricultural potential and movement on a vast scale. Yet rivers are not fixed lines on a map. They wander, divide, dry, flood, abandon one course and cut another. At Mohenjo-daro, repeated rebuilding suggests that inhabitants endured recurring flood problems rather than simply fleeing at the first disaster. Layer upon layer of construction raised parts of the city as people repaired, adapted, and persisted. The lesser-known reality is that ancient urban populations were rarely helpless before environmental threat. They often recognized risk very clearly and developed methods of living with it for centuries. The mystery is not why they failed to notice danger. It is how long their solutions worked before circumstances exceeded them, or before other political and economic pressures made adaptation impossible. On islands and coastal margins, the attraction of danger becomes even more visible. A harbour is an invitation to wealth. It gathers fishers, sailors, merchants, craftsmen, tax collectors, foreign languages, religious cults, and imported objects from far beyond the horizon. Coastal towns could become extraordinarily cosmopolitan by ancient standards, their prosperity shaped by ships arriving with the wind. But every harbour occupies an unstable threshold. Storm surges overwhelm low land. Earthquakes fracture buildings and alter coastlines. Tsunamis arrive with little warning. Sediment clogs channels, while gradual sinking can allow water to reclaim constructed ground. To abandon such a place before disaster was not an easy or obvious choice. A harbour that might one day drown a city might, for hundreds of years, be the very reason that city existed. The ancient Mediterranean is crowded with settlements born from this logic. Greek communities built beside natural anchorages and narrow straits. Phoenician traders established coastal nodes linking sea routes. Roman ports accumulated warehouses, baths, temples, workshops, taverns, docks, and neighbourhoods around the relentless movement of goods. The sea delivered wheat to feed large populations, marble for monuments, amphorae filled with oil and wine, soldiers, officials, enslaved people, news. Luxury and tax revenue, even places exposed to earthquakes or volcanic activity, could be irresistible if they sat at the intersection of fertile land and maritime commerce. Around the Bay of Naples, for example, beauty, agricultural richness, mineral waters, elite villas, fisheries, ports, and commercial towns all existed in the shadow of Vesuvius. To modern observers, the volcano dominates the landscape because history has taught them what it can do. To many ancient residents before the eruption of the year 79, the mountain was part of a productive world, perhaps ominous at times, but not necessarily an immediate reason to abandon houses, businesses, vineyards, workshops, friendships, and inherited property. Volcanoes tempt settlement with an especially cruel generosity. Their eruptions can annihilate communities, but volcanic deposits weather into exceptionally fertile soils. In many regions, people return again and again to the same threatened slopes because crops grow well there and land supports dense settlement. Around Etna in Sicily, across the volcanic zones of the Aegean in Central America, and beneath mountains throughout the Pacific world, the pattern repeats. Destruction followed by renewal, memory followed by necessity. A volcano may remain quiet beyond the span of a human life. A farmer can be born, cultivate vines or grain, raise children, grow old, and die without seeing the mountain do anything more alarming than release distant smoke. After several quiet generations, a previous eruption becomes an ancestral story rather than a daily calculation, even when earthquakes, springs, gases, or tremors offer signs of instability. People must decide what those signs mean, and leaving an entire home behind requires more than unease. Not every dangerous city stood beside a natural force capable of destroying it in a morning. Some occupied places where danger appeared as scarcity. Desert settlements are among the most delicate urban experiments ever attempted. A spring, seasonal river, underground channel, or carefully maintained irrigation system could transform barren space into orchards, fields, courtyards, markets, and caravan stations. In such places, water was architecture as much as nature. It had to be located. Directed, shared, guarded, cleaned, stored, and repaired. A city at an oasis could become wealthy because travellers crossing great dry distances depended upon it. Caravans brought incense, spices, textiles, metals, animals, documents, taxes, diplomatic messages, and rumours from worlds separated by weeks or months of travel. The settlement existed because the surrounding desert was harsh. Its isolation made the water valuable and the route necessary. Yet an oasis city could be lost through a change so modest that no dramatic eyewitness account would preserve it. A channel blocked by sediment, a lowered water table, a sequence of dry years, warfare that interrupted maintenance, a trade route diverted toward a more secure crossing, any of these might begin a decline. Once population fell, the labour needed to maintain waterworks declined with it. Fields shrank, remaining residents concentrated closer to the last dependable supply. Empty buildings became sources of reusable wood and brick. Wind entered the abandoned quarter. Over years, sand settled in places that had once been swept each morning. The city's enemy was not always a magnificent catastrophe. Sometimes it was the loss of enough hands to keep sand out and water flowing. Defensibility presented another bargain. Hills, cliffs, narrow promontories, islands, and elevated plateaus gave settlements protection from raiders and rival armies. Walls built on commanding terrain could turn a town into a fortress, and a fortress into a seat of power. But defensible locations were not always easy places to supply. Water might have to be stored in cisterns or brought through vulnerable channels. Fields lay outside walls. Roads were steep and exposed. An urban population enclosed for security could suffer terribly during siege or drought. Still, in regions shaped by warfare, a difficult hilltop city might be safer than a fertile settlement spread unprotected across a plain. Ancient cities were built not simply against nature, but against other human beings, and human danger often forced communities toward landscapes with their own hazards. At times, religion reinforced these choices. A place could matter because people believed it connected them to gods, ancestors, kingship, or the origins of their community. Sacred springs, caves, mountains, river islands, burial grounds, and ceremonial centres attracted buildings and populations even when the environment demanded constant work. Once temples, tombs, processional ways, and traditions accumulated, leaving was no longer a practical matter alone. To abandon a city might mean abandoning the burial places of ancestors, the cults that protected the community, the monuments that justified authority, and the landscape through which people understood their identity. Power also fastened populations to vulnerable places. Rulers could command labour to maintain canals, build embankments, repair walls, dig reservoirs, monumentalize capitals, and feed urban elites. A city might survive in a difficult location because a state poured resources into making it survive. When that state weakened, the environmental danger that had always been present suddenly became far harder to resist. There is a tendency to imagine people in lost cities as unaware of their exposure, living blindly beneath threats that modern science would instantly recognize. But that picture is too simple. Ancient communities often developed detailed practical knowledge of their surroundings. They read flood seasons, soil moisture, river behavior, wind, tremors, springs, crop failures, animal movement, shoreline change, and the signs of approaching storms. They constructed raised platforms, drains, canals, reservoir, seawalls, terraces, retaining walls, fire breaks, gates, defensive towers, and routes of escape. They repaired damage from earlier disasters. In some sites, the archaeological record preserves repeated rebuilding after flood, earthquake, or fire, proof not of ignorance but of determination. The decision to remain after damage was sometimes entirely rational. A city represented enormous accumulated investment houses, wells, workshops, fields, social ties, markets, religious obligations, political influence and burial plots, and familiarity with the land. Moving away meant entering uncertainty, possibly into territory already claimed by others, without guarantee of water, harvest, employment, or safety. What people could not always know was how hazards interact. A drought alone might be endured, political conflict alone might be survived, a damaged irrigation network alone might be repaired, but drought combined with warfare, trade decline, disease, elite competition, and migration could push an urban system beyond recovery. A flood might not destroy a city until it arrived after years of neglected defences. An earthquake might be survivable until it shattered buildings in a port already losing commercial importance. An eruption might strike a community whose residents had interpreted earlier tremors as familiar rather than exceptional. Scholars still debate the relative weight of environmental and human causes at many abandoned cities because collapse rarely leaves a single clean signature. Sediment can show flooding, pollen can suggest changing agriculture, bones can hint at diet or stress. Inscriptions can reveal conflict, and abandoned neighbourhoods can expose shrinking populations. But the final decision to leave is not preserved as a single layer in the ground. The hazards around a city were therefore not errors in its location. They were entangled with its success. The river threatening to drown homes also filled fields with grain. The coast vulnerable to sinking also opened a market to the world. The desert route threatened by thirst also produced caravan wealth. The volcano capable of burying streets also nourished orchards and vines. The forest later concealing stone monuments once provided rainfall, timber, game, soils, and reservoirs for populations far larger than the later landscape appeared to contain. Every buried city began as a living answer to a difficult question. How can people gather, prosper, worship, trade, defend themselves, and endure in a place that never entirely belongs to them? For a while, many answered brilliantly. The first huts became courtyards, the paths became paved roads, the ditch became a canal, the shrine became a temple, the landing place became a harbour, the market acquired weights and rules, the storage room expanded into a warehouse. The defended hill became a capital visible across the plain. A population grew confident enough to build in stone, decorate walls, enlarge gates, lay out districts, bury its dead with ceremony, and assume that the city would outlast those who lived in it. But the larger and more complex a city became, the more it depended on uninterrupted movement water flowing where it was expected, grain arriving in sufficient quantities, Labour maintaining infrastructure, trade continuing, authority holding, walls protecting, seasons remaining within known limits. The dangerous landscape was not the only threat. The very success that drew thousands of lives together created a machine that required constant care. Beneath every buried street lies not only the memory of disaster, but the remains of that fragile machine, once running loudly and confidently until something stopped it. Once a city gathers enough people within its walls, survival stops being a private skill and becomes a collective arrangement. A household may store grain, collect rainwater, keep a small hearth burning, and mend its own roof, but no household can by itself maintain the roads beneath thousands of feet, bring water to crowded neighbourhoods, dispose of waste, protect markets from fire, defend gates, preserve public order, supply temples, feed officials, or ensure that food continues to enter when nearby fields cannot support every mouth. Urban life is a remarkable exchange. People surrender some independence in return for proximity, trade, protection, ritual, work, and the conveniences of shared systems. That exchange creates wealth and beauty on a scale scattered villages rarely achieve. It also means that a city can remain standing while the invisible arrangements keeping it alive begin to fail. From the outside, an ancient city often declares itself through walls, towers, palaces, temples, monumental gates, broad staircases, and the elevated buildings of rulers or gods. These are the structures most likely to survive, and for centuries they shaped the way lost cities were imagined. Explorers looked for royal tombs, sculpted reliefs, gold, inscriptions, ceremonial plazas, and great stone architecture. Yet most inhabitants did not live their daily lives among grand monuments. They lived inside a dense working organism of small rooms, courtyards, alleys, bakeries, workshops, drains, animal pens, storerooms, wells, latrines, markets, and rubbish deposits. The strength of a city lay not only in what towered above it, but in the ordinary systems running beneath and through it. When those systems failed, even magnificent monuments could become stranded in a place no longer able to support the lives around them. Water is the clearest example. A crowded population cannot rely indefinitely on walking to the nearest stream with jars balanced on shoulders. The larger a city becomes, the more urgently it must organise access to water wells cut into reliable groundwater, cisterns lined to retain rain, channels descending from springs, aqueducts crossing valleys, ceramic pipes, fountains, reservoirs, canals, distribution basins, and rules controlling who receives water and when, in dry climates. The difference between a prosperous city and an abandoned mound may be no more than the continued functioning of a water network. Even where water seems abundant, it must remain clean enough to drink and available in the right places. A damaged conduit is not simply a broken piece of construction. It is an interruption that reaches kitchens, bathhouses, craft workshops, gardens, animals, public fountains, ritual washing, firefighting, and the health of every tightly packed neighbourhood downstream. Ancient engineers sometimes achieved results that still inspire disbelief, not because their work required mysterious lost knowledge, but because it demanded extraordinary observation, labour, organisation, and persistence. Roman aqueducts could carry water across long distances on gradients so slight that a casual observer might barely notice any descent at all. In Petra, a city carved and built amid rocky desert landscapes, channels, dams, pipes, and cisterns helped capture sudden rain that might otherwise arrive as destructive floodwater and vanish uselessly into dry ground. At Angkor, immense reservoirs, canals, embankments, and moats formed part of a water-managed landscape extending far beyond temple walls. In Maya cities, reservoirs collected and stored seasonal water in environments where reliable supply was crucial during dry months. These systems were not decorative demonstrations of power, though rulers certainly used them to express authority. They were the veins of urban survival. But every vein could clog, channels filled with sediment, dams broke, roots invaded masonry, pipes cracked in earthquakes, reservoirs became polluted or overwhelmed, aqueduct arches could be damaged by neglect or deliberate attack, canals required regular dredging, a task easy to overlook in a political crisis and difficult to organise when labour obligations fractured. Sometimes a water system designed for one pattern of rainfall confronted another. Too little water brought shortages. Too much arrived violently, damaging the very channels built to control it. One surprising detail preserved at some ancient sites is the evidence of constant adjustment channels redirected, drains enlarged, walls repaired, floors raised, buildings modified to accommodate repeated flooding or changed water levels. Cities did not generally endure until one unlucky failure surprised them. Often they spent centuries patching themselves against familiar problems, each repair leaving a mark beneath the later ruins. Food created an even larger web of dependence. A village could live close to its fields, but a substantial city drew resources from a broad surrounding region and sometimes from distant lands. Grain had to be grown, harvested, processed, transported, measured, taxed, stored, guarded from moisture and pests, milled, baked, sold, and distributed to those who produced no food of their own. Oil, wine, fish, fruit, livestock, salt, fuel, textiles, timber, pottery, metal tools, and building stone moved along routes that a city depended upon without controlling completely. Roads washed out. Rivers became difficult to navigate. Piracy threatened shipping. War interrupted harvests. Officials hoarded supplies. Prices rose. A poor family in a crowded district might feel a disturbance in distant fields long before any palace acknowledged that something had changed. Granaries and warehouses were therefore as central to urban power as temples and palaces. To hold stored grain was to hold time itself, a reserve against the uncertain interval between harvests, bad seasons, siege, disrupted trade, or political unrest. Yet stored food introduced its own vulnerabilities. Grain spoiled if damp, rats and insects consumed it. Fire could erase a season's security in a single night. Corrupt administrators could divert it. Conquerors could seize it. And when confidence failed, a city's population did not behave like an orderly diagram of supply. People bought what they could, concealed what they had, fled with what they could carry, crowded around remaining sources, and made decisions driven by children, hunger, rumour, fear, and the knowledge that public assurances do not fill an empty stomach. Fire was a constant threat in cities where cooking flames, oil lamps, workshops, kilns, timber upstories, straw, cloth, wooden doors, roof beams, stored fuel, and narrow lanes existed in close proximity. Fire did not need warfare or natural disaster to become catastrophic. One overturned lamp, one bakery oven, one workshop accident, one gust of wind through a dense neighbourhood could ignite a chain of destruction. Ancient cities repeatedly rebuilt after fires that left only foundations. Scorched plaster, fallen roof tiles, and blackened household goods, even cities largely built of stone or brick contained enough timber and combustible material for fire to tear through their interiors. Rubble from burned buildings might be levelled and built upon, sealing the traces of previous homes beneath new floors. A city could therefore carry within it multiple buried disasters long before its final abandonment. Layers of recovery demonstrating that urban life was not a stable condition, but a continual struggle against its own density. Waste presented a less dramatic but equally serious problem. Thousands of people and animals produce refuse every day: broken pottery, ash, food remains, dung, sewage, workshop debris, dead animals, construction rubble, butchered bones, shells, wastewater, spoiled goods. Archaeologists treasure ancient rubbish because it records diets, trade, crafts, disease, class differences, imported luxuries, seasonal habits, and environmental change. For those living beside it, however, rubbish was not a historical archive. It smelled, attracted pests, blocked drains, contaminated water, and helped disease move through close communities. Some cities developed sewers or drainage networks of impressive complexity. Others relied on pits, streets, open channels, removal beyond settled zones, or simply repeated accumulation. The presence of drains does not mean conditions were clean by modern standards. A carefully built channel may still have carried filth past doorways, overflowed in heavy rain, or required labour no one wanted to perform until blockage became impossible to ignore. Urban disease does not always leave a clear archaeological signature, making it one of the quieter forces in the history of buried cities. Crowded living quarters, livestock nearby, stored food attracting rodents, contaminated water, trade routes carrying unfamiliar infections, and populations already weakened by shortage could create devastating conditions. Skeletons may sometimes reveal malnutrition, chronic stress, injury, or certain diseases. But many lethal outbreaks leave little direct trace in bones. A neighbourhood appearing suddenly less occupied may represent flight, political change, economic decline, disease, destruction, or a combination of pressures. The evidence remains incomplete, yet it is difficult to imagine any densely populated ancient city avoiding recurring waves of illness, particularly when floods, famine, war, or failed sanitation weakened the ordinary barriers between survival and mass death. Beneath these material systems lay social systems just as fragile. Water did not distribute itself. Grain did not enter storehouses without labour, authority, accounting, and enforcement. Walls mattered only if people guarded them, repaired them, trusted those who controlled the gates, and believed the city was worth defending. Streets and marketplaces required some form of regulation. Religious festivals reaffirmed shared order. Courts, councils, palace officials, neighbourhood leaders, merchants, priesthoods, soldiers, scribes, builders, enslaved labourers, farmers, sailors, porters, artisans, and domestic households each occupied different positions within the structure. A city could look unified from the height of its walls while remaining divided by wealth, origin, debt, status, legal rights, access to food, access to water, and proximity to power. In times of prosperity, inequality might be tolerated, resented, ritualized, or enforced. In times of crisis, it could become explosive. A failed harvest was not equally dangerous to everyone. An elite household might have stores, rural estates, clients, servants, transport animals, and political allies. A labourer or widow might depend on daily purchases and neighbours already struggling themselves. When water ran short, whoever controlled a well or channel controlled more than a resource. When enemy forces approached, decisions about defence and evacuation exposed whose lives and property mattered most. When disaster destroyed part of a city, rebuilding could favour monuments and wealthy districts while poorer areas remained scarred or emptied. Buried neighbourhoods sometimes preserve these differences with painful clarity. Fine painted rooms not far from cramped dwellings, imported wares close to crude cooking vessels, elaborate tombs set against bodies afforded little ceremony. Catastrophe could strike broadly, but urban vulnerability was never evenly shared. Walls, the most visible promise of safety, carried their own contradiction. They protected citizens from invasion, raids, wild animals in some settings, and the insecurity of open ground. They marked identity and power. Entering through a gate meant entering an ordered place, controlled and defended. Yet walls also concentrated people. During siege, they trapped hunger, fear, disease, and political conflict inside. An attacking army did not always need to storm a city if it could cut roads, block water, destroy crops, sever canals, or simply wait. Defensive strength therefore depended on supply, morale, leadership, outside alliances, and the durability of the same networks that supported peace. Some cities were ruined when their walls failed, others died while the walls still stood, formidable but useless around empty streets. Temples and palaces were not separate from this machinery. Temples stored offerings, held land, employed workers, administered goods, legitimized rulers, and linked communal survival to divine favour. Palaces gathered taxes and tribute, directed labour, housed archives, organised military forces, sponsored craft production, and commanded construction. Their monumental appearance can distract from their practical roles as centres through which resources flowed, when authority weakened. It was not merely a symbolic loss. Repairs went unfinished. Grain collection broke down or became oppressive. Irrigation labour could not be coordinated. Distant districts stopped obeying demands. Merchants sought more reliable routes. Rivals fought over remaining wealth. What appears in archaeological layers as abandonment or burning may be the final visible expression of years in which trust and coordination steadily dissolved. There is a sober lesson in the remains of ancient urban systems. Complexity is not weakness, but it creates particular forms of dependence. A well-managed city can survive conditions that would defeat smaller communities. It can store food against famine, bring water across dry terrain, construct defences, repair after fires and floods, attract specialists, organise relief, and preserve knowledge. But when several essential networks break at once, its size becomes a burden. Thousands require water whether the aqueduct flows or not. Workshops need customers whether trade arrives or not. Walls require defenders whether the treasury can feed them or not. Temples require offerings whether families have grain to spare or not. A city is powerful because its inhabitants are connected. It is endangered for exactly the same reason. Before ash ever falls upon a rooftop, before a river deposits mud through a deserted doorway, before vines root in a palace stairway or the sea closes above a harbour, there is usually a period in which life continues with stubborn normality. Bakers light ovens, traders arrange goods, water carriers move through streets, children pass walls already cracked by earlier tremors or floods, builders patch drains, replace roof tiles, strengthen embankments, clear debris, and assume there will be time for another repair. Cities do not live in expectation of becoming ruins. They live by making danger ordinary, manageable, almost forgettable. In one Roman landscape beneath a mountain that generations had learned to regard as part of the horizon, that ordinary confidence would leave behind one of the most intimate buried worlds ever recovered from antiquity. By the 1st century of the Roman Empire, the Bay of Naples is one of the most desirable landscapes in the Mediterranean world. The sea glitters against a long curve of coast. Warm springs rise from volcanic ground. Villas spread across slopes and shorelines where senators and wealthy families escape the noise and duty of Rome. Fishing boats move in and out of small harbours. Merchant vessels carry wine, oil, grain, garum, pottery, marble, slaves, and luxuries between local towns and the larger commercial world. Behind the coastal brightness rises a mountain whose shape does not yet match the familiar modern silhouette. Vesuvius is not the dark icon of disaster it will later become. It is a wooded, cultivated presence in the background of daily life, its lower slopes productive, its danger partly forgotten, partly unreadable, and perhaps partly inconvenient to think about in a region offering so much wealth. Pompeii sits inland from the shoreline on a raised tongue of ancient volcanic ground, positioned above the surrounding plain and near the Sarno River, which in antiquity is navigable far closer to the town than it is today. Its location has practical advantages. Agricultural goods from rich nearby estates can pass toward markets and shipping. Roads link the town with neighbouring communities and with the wider Roman network. Its defensive walls belong to earlier, more uncertain centuries. But by the imperial period, many sections have lost their military urgency. The city has become not a garrison waiting for enemies, but a prosperous provincial centre, a place of property, ambition, entertainment, business, worship, politics, and relentless everyday activity. It is old even before it is buried. Different peoples and powers have shaped it. Oscan roots, Samnite influence, Roman conquest, colonization, expansion, rebuilding, adaptation. Its final form is not a newly planted city awaiting a single ending, but a dense accumulation of past choices already layered beneath the pavements. Entering Pompeii through one of its gates means joining a flow of movement. Roads are paved with large blocks of dark volcanic stone, uneven but durable, polished in places by traffic. Deep wheel ruts mark repeated journeys along familiar routes, raised stepping stones cross streets that can carry rainwater, refuse, and the waste of urban animals. The stones are placed so that pedestrians can keep their feet above the street surface, while carts pass between them. A small detail that reveals a city built not for idealised marble grandeur, but for the practical inconvenience of mud, wheels, dung, sandals, and busy human bodies, shop fronts open toward the street. Doorways lead into houses of drastically different wealth. Walls display advertisements, public notices, painted electoral endorsements, scratched names, crude drawings, accusations, boasts, and casual traces of people who treat the city not as a precious archaeological object, but as their own crowded, familiar place. The city's public centre gathers its official face. Around the forum stand buildings associated with administration, commerce, ritual, and status. Temples assert connection between civic order and divine favour. Markets organise the selling of goods. Public buildings provide spaces where legal, financial, and political business unfolds. Statues honour people important enough, wealthy enough, or useful enough to deserve a durable presence in the heart of the town. Yet Pompeii does not live only through its formal centre. Its energy runs outward through smaller intersections and local commercial clusters, through workshops where cloth is treated, metal repaired, bread milled and baked, lamps sold, wine dispensed, and meals served to people who do not dine in lavish private rooms. The city is filled with spaces where labour is visible and close at hand. It smells of smoke, fermented drink, animals, cooking oil, human waste, damp masonry, fresh bread, fish sauce, perfume in wealthier houses, and the chemical bite of trades that depend upon dyes, tanning, fulling, heat, and grime. Pompeii's bakeries offer one of the clearest glimpses of this working organism. Bills made from volcanic stone stand in some establishments like heavy hourglasses, turned by animals or enslaved labourers to grind grain. Nearby ovens are built for producing bread in quantity, because a town cannot depend on every household preparing all of its own food. Carbonised loaves, later recovered from the buried city, preserve the shape of bread divided into sections before baking. Humble objects transformed by catastrophe into symbols of interrupted normality. But before they become artefacts, they are food moving through an urban economy. Someone supplies grain. Someone grinds it. Someone kneads dough. Someone tends heat. Someone carries loaves away. Some buyers have comfortable kitchens at home. Others rely on prepared food because their lodgings lack the space or resources for elaborate cooking. The bread of Pompeii reveals not a frozen luxury world, but a city tied together by appetite and labour. Its bars and food counters, commonly known by the modern archaeological label thermopolia, open directly onto streets. Masonry counters contain large jars once holding provisions, drinks, or prepared offerings. For a person navigating the city, such places make sense: quick food, conversation, business, rest, gossip, companionship, and perhaps trouble. Many surviving houses in Pompeii are not immense estates with full dining suites and ample servants. The city includes renters, labourers, freed people, enslaved people, traders, travellers, craftspeople, and families living with limited rooms and uncertain finances. The street is not merely the gap between important houses. For many inhabitants, it is a major part of social life. Archaeology preserves elegant domestic dining rooms with painted scenes, but it also preserves the counters where less celebrated people ate, drank, negotiated, and watched the day pass. Behind more impressive entrances, Pompeii's houses reveal how the Roman urban household can project status. A visitor entering a wealthy home may pass through a narrow opening into an atrium, where light and rain fall through an opening in the roof toward a basin below. Beyond may lie garden courts, fountains, painted rooms, dining areas, private shrines, servants' working spaces, storerooms, and carefully controlled sightlines designed to impress clients and guests. Walls are covered with painted architectures, mythological figures, gardens, theatrical motifs, still lifes, erotic imagery, luxurious colours, and illusions of greater depth and openness than actual masonry provides. Some floors carry mosaics built from thousands of small pieces, turning a threshold or dining room into a declaration of taste, wealth, learning, or aspiration. Yet these houses are not sealed worlds apart from commerce. Shops may occupy their street-facing rooms. Workshops can be attached to domestic spaces. Houses change ownership, are subdivided, refurbished, repaired, or converted for profit. A noble-looking entrance does not guarantee unchanging elite life behind it. The population of Pompeii is difficult to state with certainty. Modern estimates vary because the city was not a census frozen in stone, and because counting rooms cannot cleanly count people. It may have held roughly 10,000 or somewhat more in its final years, a substantial town rather than an imperial metropolis. Within that population were freeborn citizens, local elites, freed men and women, enslaved people, migrants, visitors, labourers, merchants, innkeepers, artisans, priests, officials, farmers from the surrounding countryside, performers, sex workers, children, elderly people, and individuals whose legal and social positions left few explicit records. Inscriptions and buildings sometimes bring individuals close. They preserve names connected to election campaigns, property, commercial activity, religious office, graffiti, tombs, or ownership marks. Yet most of the people filling the streets leave no biography. Even at one of the best preserved cities in the ancient world, ordinary human identity frequently survives only as an object touched, a room inhabited, a skeleton found, or a brief name scratched into plaster. Politics is written openly on Pompeii's walls. Painted notices recommend candidates for local office. sometimes endorsed by groups of tradespeople, neighbours, or individuals. They remind modern observers that provincial civic life is active and competitive, not simply controlled from an unreachable Roman centre. Office brings status, influence, obligations, and opportunities for public display. Wealthy figures sponsor buildings, repairs, games, or improvements, and make certain that generosity is remembered. The amphitheatre, one of the earliest surviving stone structures of its kind in the Roman world, can hold large crowds for gladiatorial spectacles. Pompeii also contains theatres, baths, exercise areas, temples, and spaces for communal gathering. Leisure here is part of civic identity. A town demonstrates importance through the quality of its public facilities, the spectacles it offers, and the ways its elites spend money in view of the people whose approval and obedience matter. Not all public gatherings remain orderly. Years before the final burial, Pompeii's amphitheatre becomes the scene of a notorious clash between Pompeians and visitors from nearby Nuceria during games. The violence grows serious enough that imperial authorities punish the town by suspending such spectacles for a period. A surviving wall painting appears to depict the disturbance, showing the amphitheatre and surrounding chaos. It is a surprising fragment of local memory. An ancient urban riot represented not in a formal historical monument, but in domestic decoration. Pompeii is not a peaceful museum awaiting preservation. It has rivalries, status tensions, civic pride, impulsive violence, legal consequences, and a population capable of behaving badly at entertainment, a trait that requires little explanation across the centuries. Outside the walls, tombs line roads leading into the city, because Roman burial typically takes place beyond inhabited limits. The dead accompany arrivals and departures. Funerary monuments display names, achievements, family connection, occupation, generosity, freedom gained after enslavement, or the dignity a person hopes to maintain in public memory. This landscape of tombs gives the city a visible relationship with mortality, though not with the kind of sudden mass death that will later define it. People pass memorials on routine journeys. They know disease, accident, childbirth, violence, age, and grief. What they do not appear to grasp is that the city itself can become a funerary monument, its houses and shops forming a sealed archive of people who expected burials to remain outside the gates. A short distance closer to the coast lies Herculaneum, smaller than Pompeii, wealthier in some of its residential character, and dramatically different in what its burial will preserve. Its ancient shoreline is not where visitors see the modern sea. Volcanic deposits will later extend land outward, leaving the buried town set back from the present coast. Before that transformation, Herculaneum enjoys its position between mountain and water, with houses overlooking the bay, terraces, baths, shops, shrines, and villas in the wider vicinity. One extraordinary residence nearby, later called the Villa of the Papyri, holds a library of carbonized scrolls, the only substantial library to survive from the Greco-Roman world in its original context. At the moment before disaster, no one can know that the intense heat that destroys readability in those scrolls will also preserve them as blackened rolls, leaving later scholars with the painstaking hope of recovering philosophical texts from material too fragile to unroll by ordinary means. The towns beneath Vesuvius do not live without warning. In the year 62, or possibly 63 according to ongoing discussion of dating, a powerful earthquake strikes the region, seriously damaging Pompeii and other communities around the bay. Buildings collapse or crack, public structures require repair, temples, houses, streets, and business properties undergo rebuilding. Some owners restore rooms with care, others alter spaces or convert damaged properties toward new commercial uses. Even in the city's final years, archaeological evidence indicates repairs are still continuing. There are signs of masonry work, unfinished decoration, transformed structures, and a town adapting after a major shock. Earthquakes in Campania are not unknown, and later tremors may have been experienced as part of an unsettled but livable landscape. People do what urban populations have always done after disaster: clear debris, rebuild, improve where possible, profit where possible. Complain perhaps, continue business, and learn to live with cracked walls. It is tempting to look at that earlier earthquake as an obvious warning that residents ignored. But earthquakes do not announce a volcanic timetable. A person whose house is damaged may understand danger perfectly and still have nowhere better to establish a life, property, business, family networks, rural holdings, customers, religious commitments, and simple attachment bind people to a place. Some inhabitants may leave, others arrive, some grow wealthy in reconstruction, some lose everything. A city after earthquake is not a population making one collective decision. It is thousands of individuals navigating damaged circumstances. Scholars still debate details of Pompeii's social and economic condition in the years after the earthquake, whether it was broadly declining, energetically rebuilding, changing in character, or displaying different trends in different neighbourhoods. What survives in the record suggests neither a city abandoned in fear, nor one entirely healed. It is a place in motion, visibly scarred yet unmistakably alive. The mountain behind it offers no simple message. Ancient writers know that the region has volcanic character. The nearby fields, springs, and geological features cannot be wholly detached from that reality. Yet Vesuvius has not produced the kind of eruption remembered by the generations living in the town. Its slopes are cultivated, its outline is familiar, livelihood is arranged beneath it. Repeated small tremors in the days before the catastrophe, later recalled in written testimony. may not initially appear extraordinary enough to transform normal unease into mass evacuation. Even today, communities living near dangerous volcanoes must weigh warning signs against false alarms, disrupted livelihoods, uncertain predictions, and the powerful human assumption that a place long inhabited will remain inhabitable through another night. So the city goes on. A worker repairs plaster on a wall marked by an earlier crack. A baker prepares grain for grinding. A merchant counts jars. A wealthy household plans display and hospitality. Campaign notices continue to speak from facades. Dogs sleep in courtyards. Travellers enter by roads lined with tombs. In Herculaneum, the sea remains a familiar boundary and the mountain a familiar presence. The communities are not waiting inside an obvious death trap. They are doing what cities do after hardship, resuming patterns, rebuilding confidence, allowing urgency to fade into routine. Above them, deep beneath the cultivated slope, magma is rising into a system capable of turning day into darkness and ordinary rooms into sealed chambers of loss. The streets have already survived centuries of change and years of repair. By all visible measures that matter in daily life, they seem prepared to survive many more. At first, the mountain does not look like the end of a city. It looks like weather behaving strangely above the familiar horizon. Sometime in the year 79, on a date long repeated as late August, but now questioned by evidence suggesting a later autumn eruption, a column rises above Vesuvius with astonishing force. It does not climb like ordinary smoke from a fire or thin steam from warm ground. It drives upward, dense with pulverized rock, gas, and pumice, expanding high into the atmosphere before spreading outward at the top. Across the bay, the Roman writer Pliny the Younger later remembers its shape as resembling a pine tree, with a towering trunk that branches and broadens overhead. That comparison has become famous because it captures the terrible elegance of the eruption's beginning. A mountain that had blended into the scenery suddenly grows a second mountain above itself, one made of ash and darkness. Unfolding in the sky while people below are still deciding what they are seeing. For Pompeii, southeast of the crater, the wind determines almost everything. The eruption column carries material high above the landscape, and then the prevailing direction draws the falling debris toward the town. At first, pale pumice begins to descend. Some pieces are small, light enough to float briefly on water, products of gas-filled magma shattered during its violent escape. They bounce from roofs and gather in streets. The sound may begin as tapping and thudding, then an unending dry roar as the fall intensifies. People can move through it at first. They can look upward, collect belongings, secure doors, seek relatives, decide whether to shelter or flee. The city has not yet vanished. It is still functioning in broken, fearful fragments, its residents responding not to a known outcome but to worsening conditions whose limits no one can calculate. The first hours are filled with choices that cannot be recovered neatly from the ruins. Many inhabitants almost certainly escape early, and this matters because the buried victims represent only part of the town's population. Pompeii is not a city in which everyone simply waits at home to die. Roads leave the gates, open country lies beyond the built-up streets. The eruption is terrifying, but in its earlier stage it is not immediately fatal everywhere. Some people depart with valuables, documents, jewellery, money, tools, food, children, and whatever animals they can manage. Others remain because they expect the fall to pass, because they fear abandoning property, because relatives are missing, because the streets are becoming difficult, because darkness and falling stone make travel dangerous, or because human beings do not always recognise the last survivable hour while they are standing inside it. Some may leave and later return too soon. Some may shelter in structures that seem stronger than the open street. Some are perhaps physically unable to move quickly. The city does not make one decision. It fractures into individual judgments under pressure. As pumice accumulates, Pompeii changes shape. Streets begin to fill with loose volcanic stones, making each step more difficult. Doorways become partially blocked. Courtyards collect falling material from open roofs. Roof tiles strain beneath an increasing load they were never designed to bear. In the more prosperous houses, elegant painted rooms provide no special protection if timber beams above them give way. In shops and workshops, the familiar arrangements of trade become obstacles in dim spaces. Some inhabitants shelter under staircases, in interior rooms, or beside walls, hoping for structural security. Others try to move through the deepening deposits, perhaps covering their heads against falling fragments. The light fades as ash thickens in the air and the eruption cloud obscures the sun. Lamps may burn in rooms at hours when daylight should still be present. A city known through bright frescoes and open courtyards is submerged first not in solid earth, but in noise, dust, falling stone, cracked roofs, poor visibility, and fear. The mountain alternates in what it throws upon the town. Layers of pale pumice are followed by darker material as the composition of erupted magma changes. These layers, carefully studied in excavation, allow volcanologists and archaeologists to reconstruct phases of the event far more accurately than any dramatic imagination could. The deposit is not simply ash, and Pompeii is not gently covered as though under snow. It is buried under a rapidly growing mass of pumice ash, falling fragments, collapsed roof material, broken tiles, timber, plaster, furniture, and household objects driven downward or trapped in place. In some locations, the deposits eventually reach several meters deep. Even before the deadliest phase arrives, collapse kills people inside houses they trusted to shelter them. The buildings that had made urban life possible become dangerous as their roofs fail beneath the steady weight from above. Across the bay, Pliny the Younger observes events from Misenum with his mother, while his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commands the Roman fleet stationed there. The elder Pliny is a man of immense curiosity, a collector of knowledge who has written on the natural world, and the eruption initially draws his attention as a phenomenon worth examining. But news arrives that people near the mountain are in danger, and observation becomes attempted rescue. Ships move across troubled water toward the afflicted coastline, falling material, shifting wind, shallow shores, darkness, and the scale of the eruption make organised assistance extraordinarily difficult. Pliny the Elder reaches Stabiae, farther down the coast from Pompeii, but never returns. He dies there during the crisis, perhaps affected by toxic air, underlying health problems, or the physical stress and conditions surrounding the eruption. His nephew's later letters preserve the main surviving eyewitness account, written not as a minute-by-minute report from Pompeii itself, but as memory shaped by distance, trauma, and the request of a historian seeking information. Even one of antiquity's clearest disaster narratives remains partial. Herculaneum experiences the eruption differently. During the early pumice fall, the wind largely carries much of the falling material away from the town. Residents may see the vast cloud and feel earthquakes, while avoiding the deep accumulation already making Pompeii unrecognisable. This difference can be fatal in another way. Some may believe there is still time, that the town is less threatened, or that the shoreline offers escape by boat. For a long time, archaeologists thought relatively few bodies at Herculaneum meant that most inhabitants had successfully fled. Then excavations near the ancient beachfront uncovered hundreds of victims gathered in and around arched chambers by the shore, spaces once interpreted as boat storage areas. Men, women, and children had gone toward the water, perhaps waiting for rescue or preparing to escape, carrying jewellery, coins, keys, tools, and personal possessions. Their concentration there turns the ancient seafront into one of the most painful settings, preserved from the catastrophe, not people unaware of danger, but people who recognised it and reached a place they hoped would offer survival. The eruption column cannot remain stable forever. As the towering mass loses strength and collapses, the character of destruction changes abruptly. Hot surges and denser pyroclastic currents sweep outward from the volcano, mixtures of gas, ash, and fragments moving across the landscape at lethal speed. Herculaneum, close to Vesuvius, is engulfed by intensely hot surges and flows. The temperatures are high enough to carbonize wood, destroy bodies rapidly, preserve structural elements in altered form, and seal the town beneath dense volcanic deposits. Roof beams, wooden shutters, furniture, doors, a cradle, foodstuffs, and eventually the scrolls in the nearby villa survive not as untouched objects, but as carbonized remains protected beneath later layers. The apparent miracle of preservation is born from devastation so extreme that organic material is transformed rather than simply allowed to decay. The residents gathered at the shore have almost no chance. The heat and speed of the first lethal surge make escape impossible once it arrives. Pompeii's burial unfolds over a longer and more agonizing interval. Its depth of pumice may initially protect some areas from the earlier surges, while also trapping those still in the city within streets and buildings made nearly impassable. By morning, or what should have been morning, conditions are terrifying. Earthquakes continue. Ash clouds reduce visibility. Buildings have failed or threaten to fail. Anyone still alive faces the decision of whether to remain sheltered or attempt movement over deposits already high above the original street level. Later victims found above earlier pumice layers may have been people trying to escape during a temporary lull, people returning, or people who had survived the first phase only to emerge at the worst possible time. Their precise stories cannot be recovered. What is clear is that pyroclastic surges eventually reach Pompeii as well, hot, suffocating. Ash-rich currents race through streets and over the accumulated pumice. At this point, the last spaces of refuge become death traps. The city is not merely covered, its remaining life is extinguished. For centuries afterward, the disaster produces a strange geological mercy. The cities vanish beneath volcanic deposits before later building, weather, stone robbing, agriculture, and ordinary exposure can erase them entirely. Pompeii's upper structures suffer in places, and tunnels, treasure hunting, early excavation, looting, war damage, rain, sun, plants, and modern tourism will all take later tolls. Yet the buried lower portions of houses, shops, streets, baths, temples, paintings, mosaics, graffiti, food remains, tools, and bodies preserve a density of urban evidence rare anywhere in the ancient world. Herculaneum, buried more deeply beneath hardened volcanic material, preserves organic materials astonishingly well. Though excavation there becomes more difficult and the modern settlement above limits what can be exposed, the mountain destroys two communities and, in the same act, prevents them from dissolving almost entirely into later time. The victims at Pompeii leave behind the most famous and most easily misunderstood traces of the eruption. As bodies decayed within compacted ash, they sometimes left cavities in the hardened deposits, spaces retaining the outlines of clothing, posture, facial features, fingers, folds of cloth, sandals, and the last position of the dead. In the 19th century, excavators developed the technique of pouring plaster into these voids before removing surrounding material, creating casts of people and animals at the moment their bodies have been enclosed by volcanic debris. The results are difficult to view without emotion: an adult curled defensively, a child close to others, A dog twisted against its chain, figures prone in ash, bodies whose gestures invite stories almost immediately. Yet care is needed. A cast reveals posture and material circumstance, not final thoughts, exact relationships, or a complete account of suffering. Some early interpretations turned individuals into dramatic characters with greater confidence than the evidence allowed. Modern study, including scanning and forensic analysis where possible, seeks more careful knowledge while recognizing that these remains belong to real people, not theatrical props in a tale of doom. Even the apparently frozen city refuses to be a perfect final day. Pompeii was already under repair from earthquakes. Some rooms were empty because construction was underway. Some valuables were carried out by refugees or removed after the event by survivors and looters tunneling through deposits. Human remains do not represent everyone who lived there, and their distribution does not record the whole sequence of flight, return, rescue, and death. Objects fall from upper floors. Walls collapse and mix contents. Early excavations sometimes removed artifacts without preserving context in the meticulous manner expected today. The city that emerges is extraordinarily vivid, but it is not an untouched Roman time capsule. It is a damaged, selectively preserved, repeatedly disturbed city whose silence can encourage more certainty than it deserves. Still, few archaeological places narrow the distance between ancient lives and modern observers so sharply. A written political slogan remains on a wall in a town whose elections will never take place. Bread remains inside an oven, after appetite has become irrelevant. Bronze utensils, lamps, locks, counters, painted gardens, medical instruments, jewellery, gaming pieces, wine jars, household shrines. And the marks of repairs all remain beneath the shadow of a catastrophe, whose stages can be read in layers across the rooms. At Herculaneum, wooden objects survive in blackened form, where in most ancient cities only iron fittings or stains would remain. The scrolls of the Villa of the Papyri carry the possibility that works lost everywhere else might still be hidden inside their charred surfaces, slowly approached through modern imaging rather than physical opening. Burial has taken away the city's future, yet guarded fragments of their past with an almost cruel precision. When the eruption finally subsides, the coast is altered, buildings have disappeared beneath deposits, and a familiar inhabited landscape has been replaced by a pale and dark expanse of ruin. Survivors remain somewhere beyond the buried zone, people who escaped with memory, grief, loss, and perhaps knowledge of where a doorway, field, household shrine, business account, or loved one now lies beneath the volcanic surface. There is evidence that recovery and searching occurred, and valuable materials were later extracted in places. But Pompeii and Herculaneum do not return as functioning cities. Their streets pass from civic space into sealed terrain. The Forum no longer gathers citizens. The bakery no longer feeds anyone. The seafront chambers hold the remains of those who reached the water too late. Vesuvius has done what the slow forces of abandonment often require centuries to achieve. It has removed entire urban communities from ordinary time. Yet even this most famous example of a city buried forever carries an unusual clarity. There is a mountain, an eruption, written testimony, geological layers, identifiable victims, and streets that can be walked again. Elsewhere, burial is less direct. A settlement can disappear beneath ash without leaving eyewitnesses. Its people gone before the final event. Its catastrophe connected to distant changes no surviving account can explain. Far out in the Aegean, beneath brilliant white volcanic material, another town waits with storerooms, staircases, beds, vessels, and painted walls, but almost none of the human bodies that make Pompeii's ending so painfully immediate. Its silence preserves a different mystery, not simply how a city died, but where its people went before the ash arrived. Across the Aegean Sea, the island now called Santorini curves around a flooded volcanic centre, like the broken rim of a vast stone bowl. White villages cling to cliffs today above water of impossible blue, but the beauty of the modern island is the exposed interior of an ancient catastrophe. In the Bronze Age, long before classical Greece, before the Parthenon, before the wars and philosophers that later dominate popular memory of the Aegean, this island was known as Thera. On its southern coast stood a prosperous settlement now called Akrotiri, a town of paved lanes, multi-storey buildings, storerooms, workshops, elaborate drainage, imported goods, painted rooms, and sea-facing lives bound tightly to the networks of the eastern Mediterranean. Then the volcano beneath the island erupted with enormous force. Ash and pumice buried the town so completely that its surviving remains would invite comparisons with Pompeii. Yet Akrotiri preserves something far stranger than the Roman city beneath Vesuvius. It preserves rooms and objects, staircases and paintings, pots and beds, but almost no direct evidence of the people who once used them. The city seems to have been emptied before it was entombed. When archaeologists began revealing Akrotiri in the 20th century, they uncovered not a crude outpost at the edge of the Bronze Age world, but a settlement of startling sophistication. Buildings rise 2 and sometimes 3 stories, built of stone, mud brick, timber reinforcement, and plaster. Narrow roads pass between closely packed structures. Drainage channels run beneath streets and connect with domestic facilities in a way that reveals serious attention to urban cleanliness and convenience. Inside houses, rooms hold large ceramic containers for storing oil, grain, wine, pulses, or other essentials. Workshops preserve evidence of craft activity. Imported pottery and materials point outward across the sea, toward Crete, mainland Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, and the broader trading world. Akrotiri is not merely surviving on an island. It is participating in a maritime economy in which ships carry goods, artistic ideas, prestige objects, technologies, and beliefs between coastlines that seem separate on a map but were intimately connected by water. Its walls preserve the most vivid part of that connected world. Frescoes unfold across plaster in colours still capable of astonishing those who enter their restored spaces or study their fragments. Blue monkeys move through a rocky landscape, swallows sweep above lilies, young figures carry fish, women appear richly dressed and carefully adorned. A complex miniature scene shows ships travelling between settlements, with buildings, people, shorelines, animals, perhaps ceremony, perhaps commerce, perhaps an idealised image of movement across the sea. The paintings do not tell a complete story, and their meanings remain debated, but they show that the people of Akrotiri regarded the natural world, travel, ritual, status, and display as worthy of extraordinary visual investment. A settlement buried under volcanic debris turns out to have been full of colour before it became white with ash. The relationship between Akrotiri and the Minoan civilization of Crete has long fascinated scholars. Many features of its art, architecture, objects, and maritime orientation reflect strong links with Minoan culture, whose palaces and towns flourished to the south on Crete. Akrotiri may not have been a Minoan colony in any simple sense. Local identity and outside influence are difficult to disentangle from the surviving evidence. Yet its residents clearly occupied a world in which Crete mattered enormously. Ideas travelled alongside goods. Artistic styles could cross open sea. Administrative and commercial relationships may have linked island communities into wider systems of exchange. When modern observers look at the frescoes of Akrotiri, they see more than decoration in a vanished house. They see a fragment of an Aegean world confident in navigation, skilled in construction, practiced in luxury, and dependent upon connections that a great eruption could suddenly fracture. The precise date of the eruption remains one of the most important and contested questions in Bronze Age archaeology. Scientific dating methods, including radiocarbon evidence, have often suggested a date in the later 17th century BCE, while some archaeological synchronisms with Egypt and surrounding regions have historically favoured a later date in the 16th century BCE. The debate matters because the eruption is not an isolated local incident. Fixing its date affects the chronology of trade, political developments, artistic change, and the relationship between Aegean societies and Egypt. Scholars continue to refine evidence from tree rings, ice core signals, radiocarbon calibration, pottery sequences, and imported materials. Yet no single line of evidence has silenced every disagreement. Akrotiri therefore stands not only beneath ash, but inside one of archaeology's most persistent chronological puzzles. What is beyond dispute is that the eruption was enormous. Before the final catastrophe, earthquakes appear to have damaged the town, walls collapsed, staircases broke, and residents began clearing debris and undertaking repairs. This detail brings Akrotiri unexpectedly close to Pompeii, whose people likewise lived amid reconstruction before burial. At Akrotiri, however, the interval between earthquake damage and the Great Ashfall may have allowed people to respond more completely. Archaeologists have found indications that some rooms were being cleared, that valuable portable objects were missing, and that ordinary domestic arrangements had been disturbed before the settlement disappeared beneath volcanic material. Heavy furniture and storage containers remain, but many easily carried items do not, unlike Pompeii and Herculaneum, where bodies preserve the last moments of those overtaken by disaster. Akrotiri has yielded no comparable concentration of victims within the excavated town. That absence is haunting precisely because it suggests action. The inhabitants appear to have recognised enough danger to leave. Perhaps earthquakes provided warning. Perhaps volcanic activity became impossible to ignore. Perhaps the first signs of eruption unfolded gradually enough for evacuation. They may have moved temporarily to open ground or boarded ships. They may have expected to return after the shaking ceased, leaving bulky possessions behind because homes could be repaired and jars replaced once the danger passed. A population abandoning an entire settlement rarely does so without hope of return, especially when houses, storerooms, trade goods, sacred spaces, and family wealth remain rooted in place. But no written account survives from Akrotiri to reveal the plans, arguments, or fears of those who walked away. Their successful escape from the town, if successful it was, produces deeper uncertainty. The ruins show where they were no longer present, but not where they found safety. The sea that sustained Akrotiri may have become its greatest danger. A volcanic eruption of this scale can generate tsunamis through collapsing material, caldera formation, pyroclastic flows entering the sea, or related disturbances. Evidence for tsunami impacts has been studied on neighbouring islands and along parts of Crete, though reconstructing the exact timing, height, and consequences of ancient waves remains difficult. If inhabitants of Thera fled by boat or gathered along coasts, their escape may have placed them in the path of a second catastrophe. It is also possible that many reached safety elsewhere and became archaeologically invisible, absorbed into communities whose records do not identify them as refugees from a destroyed island. The evidence remains incomplete. There is no excavated assembly of bodies answering the question, no surviving letter describing the evacuation, no inscription saying who arrived across the water after their home vanished. Akrotiri's empty rooms are not proof of a peaceful rescue. They are proof only that the known town was largely cleared of human life before burial. The stages of destruction begin with falling pumice and ash, then culminate in volcanic violence that transforms the island itself. Like pumice blankets, buildings and streets, roofs and upper levels are damaged beneath the accumulating weight. Hot surges and dense deposits seal the remains. The eruption empties so much magma from below that the volcanic structure collapses, helping form the dramatic caldera that defines Santorini today. Though the island's geological shape has continued to change through later eruptions and erosion, Akrotiri is covered beneath layers of volcanic material several meters deep, hidden from ordinary occupation and protected from weather. Its preservation is remarkable because the burial seals lower walls, storage vessels, plaster surfaces, architectural features, and in some cases impressions left by objects that decayed away. Wooden furniture itself largely vanished. But voids and traces within the deposits have allowed reconstructions of beds, tables, and other household forms. A room may contain no surviving person, yet still preserve the shape of how that person arranged daily life. One of Akrotiri's most revealing qualities is the absence of royal spectacle. There is no single enormous palace dominating the excavated settlement in the fashion of monumental centres known elsewhere. Wealth, artistry, and organisation appear dispersed among impressive buildings, though the incomplete area excavated means caution is necessary before drawing sweeping political conclusions. This creates a town that feels less like a royal stage and more like an affluent urban community shaped by trade and seafaring. Large houses display frescoes and imported goods, storage points to commercial and agricultural activity. Specialised rooms hint at production and administration, yet the identity of those governing the settlement, the language they used, the precise nature of their political relationship with Crete or neighbouring islands, and the social distinctions encoded in its architecture remain matters of interpretation rather than certainty. The name Akrotiri itself is modern, borrowed from the nearby village. Whatever its Bronze Age inhabitants called their town has not survived. This is one of the quietest forms of burial, not only streets and houses covered, but the city's own name erased. Pompeii can be identified by inscriptions and textual memory. Akrotiri emerges without that advantage, a rich and intricate urban place forced into modern knowledge under a label it never knew. Even the painted figures on its walls are voiceless. They offer clothing, movement, ritual possibility, ships, animals, and landscapes, but no captions explaining identity or intention. The buried town is vivid enough to seem familiar and silent enough to resist possession. For many years, the eruption of Thera was popularly presented as the catastrophe that destroyed Minoan civilization almost in a single stroke, and sometimes even as the historical seed of the Atlantis legend. The appeal is understandable in island culture, a massive volcanic disaster, maritime wealth, destruction, and later stories of lands lost to the sea, but the archaeological picture is more restrained and more interesting. The Atlantis connection is speculative and unsupported as a direct historical identification. Minoan Crete did not simply disappear at the moment Thera erupted. Important centres on Crete continued after the event, and the eventual transformations of Minoan power involved complex processes including political change, economic disruption, possible natural disasters, and increasing mainland Greek influence or control. The eruption may have damaged coastal settlements, interrupted trade, affected agriculture, shaken religious or political confidence, and weakened systems already facing pressures, yet no single explanation fully accounts for the later changes across the Aegean. This complexity changes the meaning of Akrotiri. It is not valuable merely as evidence for a dramatic theory in which one explosion destroys a whole civilization. It is valuable because it preserves the fragile brilliance of a town embedded in a wider world. Its survival under ash shows the quality of Bronze Age urban architecture, the scale of maritime contact, the refinement of domestic art, and the difficulty of tracking human consequences when populations depart before the destruction becomes archaeologically visible. Pompeii confronts the observer with death in place. Akrotiri confronts the observer with absence. In Pompeii, the question is often what happened during the final hours. At Akrotiri, the question is where everyone went, what they saw from a distance, what they lost, and whether some survivors lived long enough to describe to children an island of painted walls and busy streets that no longer existed above ground. When the ash settles, the town is preserved without inhabitants to reopen its doors. Rain does not immediately strip the paintings. New builders do not quarry the walls room by room. Shops are not converted for later needs. The settlement drops out of inhabited time, buried beneath a pale volcanic shroud. Ships may still cross the Aegean, carrying news of what has occurred. Refugees may reach other shores. Trading relationships may adjust. Political centres may absorb the shock or exploit it. But on Thera, staircases lead upward into packed ash. Storage jars wait in rooms whose owners never return, and painted swallows continue to fly across plaster in perpetual spring. The buried city keeps the appearance of life while withholding its ending. Not every ancient city would receive even this sudden, terrible form of preservation. Many would empty without one decisive eruption to seal their walls, or one catastrophe dramatic enough to leave a clear scar across the landscape. The people would move away over decades and generations. Their rulers would lose authority. Their reservoirs would silt. Their fields would dry. Their roads would vanish under vegetation. In the tropical lowlands of the Maya world, stone temples and palaces would remain standing long after crowds, markets, ceremonies, dynasties, and labour networks had faded, not beneath white ash, but beneath roots, leaf mould, rain, and a forest so dense that a civilization's urban scale could be hidden in plain sight. No volcanic cloud descends over the great Maya cities of the southern lowlands. No single morning turns stairways white with ash or seals painted rooms behind a wall of pumice. The disappearance here is slower, greener, and in some ways more difficult to understand. Rain keeps falling, though not always reliably enough. Trees keep growing. Stone monuments remain upright in plazas long after the rulers carved upon them have lost the power to command anyone. Houses collapse one roof at a time. Reservoir edges soften, causeways disappear beneath leaf litter, courtyards where scribes, nobles, traders, farmers, captives, priests, children, and labourers once moved under intense tropical heat gradually become places of roots and shadows. Within a few centuries, large parts of a densely inhabited urban landscape are no longer cities in the ordinary human sense at all. They are ridges and forest, steep green mounds, broken stairways wrapped in vines, carved stones standing amid insects and wet vegetation, the remnants of a world not obliterated by a single catastrophe, but emptied by pressures that gathered until remaining became harder than leaving. The Maya lowlands stretch across regions now belonging to Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, and neighbouring areas, a landscape that can appear lush enough to promise abundance without limit. Yet tropical greenery is not the same as easy agriculture. In many parts of the southern lowlands, rivers are absent or seasonally unreliable, soils can be thin or difficult, and rainfall is concentrated into wet and dry seasons. Water may be everywhere during heavy storms and urgently scarce months later. To sustain large populations, Maya communities built reservoirs, modified wetlands, cultivated fields, managed forests, terraced slopes in some regions, and developed landscapes in which human work and natural resources were closely entangled. Their cities rose not as compact stone islands surrounded by untouched jungle, but as centres within broad inhabited zones, royal compounds, temples, plazas, markets, workshops, causeways, neighbourhoods, gardens, quarries, fields, water systems, and smaller settlements connected by obligation and exchange. At their height, places such as Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, Copan, Palenque, Yaxchilan, Piedras Negras, and many others were not ceremonial ruins waiting to be engulfed by trees. They were living political capitals and urban communities, shaped by dynasties who recorded their legitimacy in stone and stucco. Towering pyramids and temple platforms lifted ritual activity toward the sky. Palaces spread around courtyards where rulers received visitors, oversaw officials, conducted ceremonies, and managed alliances. Carved stele displayed kings in elaborate regalia, presenting victories, accessions, bloodletting rites, royal ancestry, captives, and sacred time through a writing system now substantially readable after generations of scholarship. The monuments once seemed to suggest a peaceful society of astronomer priests absorbed in calendars and stars. Decipherment changed that picture. Maya inscriptions reveal a political world alive with warfare, rivalry, marriage alliances, humiliation of enemies, contested succession, shifting loyalties, and the dangerous ambition of courts competing across the lowlands. The forest concealed not only temples, but a crowded human landscape. Recent mapping technologies, especially airborne LIDAR capable of detecting subtle ground forms beneath dense canopy, have dramatically expanded understanding of the scale and organisation of Maya settlement. Causeways connect centres once thought isolated. Defensive earthworks reveal episodes of serious insecurity. Terraces, canals, platforms, residential compounds, reservoirs, and field systems show extensive alteration of land. Some regions held far more people and more elaborate infrastructure than earlier observers could see while moving through jungle at ground level. This is a crucial correction to the romance of the lost city. The great Maya centres were not mysterious monuments built in empty wilderness and then inexplicably abandoned to nature. They stood within heavily worked environments whose survival depended upon rainfall, food production, labour coordination, trade, political stability, and the willingness of people to continue supporting ruling institutions that demanded immense effort. For centuries, that effort produced extraordinary results. Tikal rose above the forest canopy with steep temple pyramids visible across broad distances. Calakmul became the heart of a powerful kingdom that challenged rivals through diplomacy and warfare. Caracol expanded through military and political success. Palenque shaped refined architecture and inscriptions around dynastic memory. Copan, on the southeastern edge of the Maya world, developed sculpture and hieroglyphic monuments of astonishing detail. Kings traced their authority through ancestors and sacred obligation, binding local populations to courts whose rituals promised order in a universe measured by cycles of time. Commoner households farmed, produced tools and pottery, raised children, honoured ancestors, gathered fuel, tended useful plants, worked for elites, exchanged goods, and endured taxes or labour demands. Their lives rarely appear by name on monumental texts, yet the splendour of royal centres depended upon their harvests, their hands, their water management, and their continued acceptance of a social order that placed enormous resources in the service of dynastic power. That order was never stable for long. Maya rulers did not govern one unified empire stretching peacefully across the lowlands. They ruled kingdoms linked and divided by diplomacy, family relationships, tribute, ritual prestige, and war. A successful ruler could enlarge influence, secure roots, install allies, capture noble enemies, commission monuments, and proclaim a flourishing reign. A defeated dynasty could lose authority quickly. Warfare damaged more than palace pride. It interrupted farming, displaced communities, threatened water systems, cut trade connections, increased defensive burdens, and forced people to devote labour to security rather than maintenance or food. Fortifications discovered in parts of the lowlands suggest that conflict could become severe. Burned structures at some sites indicate episodes of destruction. Monuments sometimes cease not because the carvers forgot their craft, but because the political machinery that funded royal history no longer functions as it once did. Around the 8th and 9th centuries, many major centres in the southern lowlands enter a profound transformation, often described as the classic Maya collapse. The phrase is useful only if treated carefully. The Maya people didn't vanish. Maya communities survived, adapted, migrated, and continue into the present. Nor did every region decline in the same way or at the same moment. Northern centres would flourish in different patterns, and smaller populations continued in landscapes where royal capitals lost much of their former scale. What collapses in many southern lowland areas is a particular urban and political order, divine kingship expressed through monument building, great courtly centres supported by dense populations, long-distance rivalries among powerful dynasties, and the infrastructure of authority that kept these urban worlds functioning. Climate evidence has added a severe environmental pressure to that picture. Studies of lake sediments, cave deposits, and other paleoclimate records indicate episodes of significant drought during the broader period of political breakdown, including repeated dry intervals that would have strained societies dependent on seasonal rain and stored water. A single poor season can be survived through reserves, alternative foods, exchange, or reduced consumption. The sequence of severe droughts is different. Reservoirs drop lower, crops fail more frequently, forest resources are pressed harder. Elites who once claimed ritual power over order and fertility confront a landscape no ceremony can reliably refill. People expected to provide labour or tribute may become less willing or less able to maintain courts, whose demands remain high while survival grows uncertain. Yet drought alone does not explain everything. Some cities decline before, during, or after different climatic stresses. Some communities show resilience, political conflict, population density, environmental degradation, social inequality, disrupted exchange, and failing legitimacy interact with water scarcity in ways no single deposit can fully reconstruct. Water was especially unforgiving in cities without permanent nearby rivers or lakes. At Tikal, large reservoirs collected rainfall for use across dry periods. Their construction demonstrates planning and engineering, but also dependence. When rain fails repeatedly, even an impressive reservoir becomes a measure of approaching shortage. Evidence from some Maya reservoirs suggests problems of contamination as urban stress intensified, including conditions in which stored water may have become unhealthy. The detail is sobering. The public works meant to carry a population through dry months may, under severe strain, have become less reliable precisely when the city needed them most. At the same time, deforestation associated with farming, fuel, construction, and plaster production may have affected local environments, increased erosion, and made water management more difficult in places. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor, but what survives in the record suggests cities facing not one fatal blow, but a narrowing set of options. The monuments themselves begin to record silence. For generations, rulers commissioned dated inscriptions marking ceremonies, victories, accessions, anniversaries, and lineage. Then at many centres, new dated monuments become rarer and stop altogether. The end of monumental writing is not necessarily the exact moment a city empties, but it marks the fading of a political voice that once insisted upon permanence. A king's image carved in stone is meant to carry memory beyond death, to declare that his dynasty belongs to the structure of time itself. When no successor erects another monument, the plaza changes meaning. The old ruler remains standing, elaborately dressed and permanently confident, while the living system that gave his image authority weakens around him. Weeds enter paved areas. Buildings are no longer freshly coated in bright plaster. Repairs become less ambitious. Ritual may continue in altered forms, perhaps conducted by fewer people among structures already beginning to decay. In some cities, the last inhabitants seem to have lived amid monuments inherited from a more powerful age. Elite buildings may be occupied differently, altered, subdivided, neglected, or used for activities their builders never intended. Valuable objects are removed. Burials or offerings appear in spaces whose roles have changed. The end is not always a dramatic evacuation, and it is not a simple march from glory into emptiness. Some families remain after courts diminish. Some groups move toward other centres, coasts, northern regions, river valleys, or smaller settlements offering better prospects. Some sacred places continue receiving visitors long after permanent urban population declines. A temple can remain meaningful even when the neighbourhood that once supported its ceremonies has vanished. Cities may die administratively before they die spiritually, and ritual memory can outlast roofs, markets, and royal officials. Then the tropical landscape begins its long work of concealment. Without labourers clearing plazas and repairing drainage, seeds settle in cracks, shrubs take hold in accumulated soil, trees rise beside walls and eventually upon them. Roots force apart masonry blocks, while rain washes loosened plaster from surfaces once painted in brilliant reds, blues, yellows, and creams. Fallen leaves gather in rooms and decay into soil. Termites and moisture consume wood. Houses made of perishable materials disappear more rapidly than stone temples, creating the false impression that the ceremonial centre stood alone rather than amid extensive residential districts. Mud, erosion, and vegetation blur platforms into natural-looking rises. Taller pyramids survive as forested hills whose geometry is not obvious until someone recognises the unnatural angle beneath the green. The forest does not restore an untouched wilderness. It grows over a transformed landscape. Species distributions, soils, terraces, abandoned reservoirs, old orchard plants, charcoal, field boundaries, causeways, quarry pits, and earthworks retain evidence of human hands. In this sense, the jungle that hid the Maya cities also preserved the outline of their scale. Early European outsiders encountering monumental ruins sometimes described them as isolated wonders in a wild interior. But local Maya people knew of many sites and lived in continued relationship with the broad land. The idea of a civilization entirely lost until outsiders discovered it distorts both ancient survival and modern knowledge. These cities were abandoned or diminished as urban capitals, not removed from the memory of every person connected to their descendants and surroundings. Their concealment nevertheless changed how the past could be seen. A volcanic city like Pompeii preserves a disaster layer sharp enough to divide before from after. Maya cities demand a different kind of patience. Their end must be traced through the final carved dates, shrinking construction programs, broken trade patterns, evidence of warfare, food and water stress, drought records preserved in caves and lake beds, household changes, defensive works, scattered burning, demographic decline, and the slow advance of living roots across abandoned architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, because the urban world itself was too interconnected for only one failure to matter. Royal power depended on harvests. Harvest depended on rain and labour. Water storage depended on maintenance. Maintenance depended on authority and cooperation. Warfare intensified scarcity. Scarcity weakened authority. Migration reduced the labour available to preserve systems already in trouble. By the time the canopy closes above many southern lowland capitals, the people have not disappeared into mystery. They have made choices under conditions that no longer reward the old concentration of life and power. They carry language, ritual, agricultural knowledge, family memory, skills, and identities onward into other communities in later centuries. Behind them, stone rulers remain in empty plazas, still presenting triumph to an audience of rain. Reservoirs fill with sediment. Palace stairways host routes thicker than human limbs. Roads built to move officials, goods, and processions become faint lines beneath forest. It is burial without a tomb, a civilization's urban heart concealed not by an instant blanket of ash, but by the return of vegetation to spaces once kept open by thousands of daily acts. And in that green silence lies a warning different from the one left by Vesuvius or Thera. A city need not be destroyed in a single spectacular hour to be lost. It can endure drought after drought, war after war, repair after repair, political compromise after political compromise, until the systems that once made it magnificent ask more from its people than the city can give back. Far across the tropical world, another enormous urban landscape would also be held together by water, labour, kingship, sacred architecture, and an environment both generous and demanding. At Angkor, towers would rise like stone peaks above reservoirs and canals on a scale almost beyond belief, only for water itself, managed so brilliantly for centuries to become part of the story of decline. In the flat, humid plains of Cambodia, stone towers rise above trees with the shape of mountains imagined by human hands. Their faces darkened by rain, their carved surfaces softened by centuries, their galleries cool after the heavy brightness outside, no roots grip fallen blocks, moats hold reflections of lotus, sky, and crumbling masonry, to a visitor standing before Angkor Wat or moving through the monumental gates of Angkor Thom. The remains seem to belong to a sacred city built on an almost unbelievable scale, then left behind for the forest to reclaim. But the temples are only the most durable fragments of something far larger. The true city of Angkor was not confined to walls around famous monuments. It spread across an engineered landscape of canals, embankments, reservoirs, roads, ponds, rice fields, occupation mounds, wooden houses, village shrines, workshops, bridges. A neighbourhood so extensive that much of it could disappear without leaving towering ruins. Beneath trees and cultivated ground lies the outline of one of the greatest urban complexes of the pre-modern world, a city whose power grew from its ability to manage water across immense distances, and whose transformation may have begun when that same system could no longer absorb the extremes imposed upon it. The landscape offers no large permanent river flowing through the urban centre, like the Nile through Egypt or the Tiber through Rome. Angkor depends instead upon the rhythm of the monsoon, the seasonal alternation between abundance and shortage. Rain arrives intensely during the wet months, filling streams, ponds, fields, and low ground, while the dry season demands that water already captured or retained continue sustaining people, crops, animals, ritual spaces, and authority. This is not merely a background condition. It shapes the entire form of the city, from the 9th century onward, as Khmer rulers establish and enlarge their capitals in the Angkor region. They build not only temples dedicated to divine kingship and cosmic order, but enormous features in the earth reservoirs known as borees, channels, moats, dikes, spillways, bridges, and modified waterways. Some help move or hold water, some mark sacred and royal space, and many likely serve overlapping practical, political, and symbolic purposes. At Angkor, engineering and belief do not stand apart. The ordered landscape around a temple can express the ordered universe claimed by a ruler, while also helping support the population whose labour makes that claim visible. The largest reservoirs are astonishing even by modern standards of ancient construction. The East Baray, created during the early expansion of the capital, stretches for several kilometres. Later, the West Baray becomes still larger, an enormous rectilinear body of water roughly 8 kilometres long, visible even today as an unmistakable human alteration of the land. Building such works requires not only excavation and planning, but political capacity officials able to command labour. Communities compelled or persuaded to provide it, engineers who understand slopes and flows, and rulers wealthy enough to turn earth-moving into a declaration of legitimacy. A reservoir at this scale announces that the king can gather human energy, reshape water, and impose order upon the seasonal uncertainty of the plain. Yet no reservoir exists only as a monument. Water collected, diverted, released, stored, or distributed influences farming, settlement, local water tables, transport, and resilience during dry periods. Angkor's greatness cannot be separated from this long attempt to make monsoon water serve an urban world of exceptional size. The city itself is unlike the compact walled centres familiar from many ancient histories. There are fortified and monumental enclosures, especially Angkor Thom, with its broad moat and gates crowned by immense faces. But beyond them lies a dispersed low-density urban fabric. Wooden houses and lighter structures stand on occupation mounds, grouped around ponds and local temples. Fields and habitation interweave. Roads run outward from ceremonial centres. Channels carve long lines through the plain. Local water features support everyday life at a scale distinct from the great royal works. For generations, much of this urban fabric was difficult to recognise because wood decayed, earthworks softened, vegetation concealed subtle elevation changes, and the monumental temples drew almost all attention. Remote sensing and LiDAR surveys later revealed patterns beneath the canopy and across the wider landscape residential mounds, grids, canals, embankments, former fields, roadways, and water control works extending far beyond the postcard image of temples and jungle. Angkor was not a cluster of shrines in wilderness. It was a vast agro-urban region, a lived environment whose population may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though precise estimates remain a matter of continuing study. At the heart of this world stands a sequence of rulers whose building programs alter the political and physical landscape again and again. Early capitals in the region established traditions of temple-centered power and hydraulic construction. In the 12th century, Suryavarman II commissions Angkor Wat, a monumental temple complex originally dedicated to Vishnu, surrounded by a moat and oriented with unusual westward emphasis. Its towers embody a sacred mountain, its bas-reliefs present gods. Battles, royal processions, heavens, underworlds, and the churning of the cosmic ocean with extraordinary precision. Later in the same century, following a destructive Cham incursion, Jayavarman VII oversees a burst of building activity on a breathtaking scale. He establishes Angkor Thom as a new royal city, with a bayon at its centre, its towers bearing vast enigmatic faces. He sponsors roads, bridges, rest houses, hospitals, reservoirs, temples, and religious foundations across the empire. This is urban power made material everywhere in stone, in movement, in water, in the idea that a ruler can restore a wounded realm through construction, devotion, and administration. But great building is not free. Every temple precinct requires quarrying, transport, specialised craft, food for workers, organisation, and continuing maintenance. Every canal and embankment creates new demands of inspection and repair. Every expansion of elite institutions draws resources through a system that must keep producing enough rice, labour, loyalty, and control. Angkor's monuments testify to confidence and capacity, but they may also reveal the growing weight carried by the society supporting them. Stone endures, and therefore makes royal ambition visible. The homes, farming routines, work obligations, and local negotiations beneath that ambition are harder to see. A family living near a pond within Angkor's enormous inhabited landscape may encounter imperial splendour through labour demands, temple service, taxes, markets, religious festivals, road use, or the authority of local elites. For that family, the city's water network is not an abstract achievement. It is the condition under which rice grows. The dry season can be survived, and a household remains attached to the place. For a long time, the system works well enough to help sustain repeated political and architectural flourishing. The annual rains fall, water moves through channels and lowlands, fields produce harvests, religious centres receive offerings, goods circulate, rulers build and rebuild. Even disruption does not bring immediate ending. The Khmer political world experiences warfare, succession struggles, changing religious priorities, regional rivalries, and shifts in royal focus. Yet Angkor continues. This endurance is important, because it warns against imagining decline as a sudden punishment for excessive scale. Large systems are not doomed simply because they are large. They can be remarkably resilient when conditions remain within the range they are built to handle, and when communities still maintain them. Angkor lasted for centuries because its inhabitants knew how to live within this wet and dry landscape. And because its institutions repeatedly adapted to changing political and environmental realities. Then, in the later centuries of Angkor's dominance, the monsoon pattern appears to turn dangerously irregular. Climate reconstructions based on tree rings and other evidence indicate prolonged droughts during parts of the 14th and 15th centuries, interrupted by unusually intense rainfall episodes. Drought alone would strain reservoirs, crops, household ponds, food supplies, and political confidence. Years of excessive rain after drought could prove destructive in a different way. Dry conditions encourage modification, diversion, repair, and urgent attempts to preserve water. Powerful downpours can then rip through channels, erode embankments, damage outlets, move vast quantities of sediment, and overload systems already stressed by scarcity and maintenance demands. A network designed to moderate seasonal variation is confronted not merely with less water or more water, but with unpredictable extremes arriving across generations of political change. Traces of this stress remain in the ground. Channels show severe erosion. Sediments suggest episodes in which water carried destructive loads through the urban system. Parts of the network appear to have been altered as inhabitants attempted to redirect flows or respond to changing conditions. At certain critical points, failure in one section could affect large portions downstream or upstream because the network was deeply connected. This is the hidden danger in brilliant infrastructure. A small local pond can fail locally. A vast integrated system can transmit problems across distance. If a major canal silts or breaches, if a diversion drives water with unusual force through vulnerable areas, if a reservoir cannot be filled or drained effectively, the consequences touch agriculture, habitation, roads, ritual spaces, and the confidence that the centre can still keep order. The water system does not suddenly turn against its builders like a creature in a legend. It becomes less dependable under pressures it was not easily able to absorb. The decline of Angkor cannot, however, be explained by climate alone. To reduce an immense political transformation to rainfall would be to miss the human world operating within the canals and temples. During the same broad period, Southeast Asian trade networks increasingly favour maritime connections and regions nearer navigable routes and ports. Political and economic gravity shifts toward the south, closer to waterways connected with international commerce. Theravada Buddhism grows in importance across the region, altering religious institutions and perhaps reducing the older form of temple-based royal organisation that had supported immense elite foundations. Rival kingdoms exert military pressure, and Ayuthya's forces attack Angkor in the 15th century. Internal political changes may have weakened the capacity to repair large-scale infrastructure or maintain the former capital at earlier intensity. Scholars still debate the precise relationship among environmental stress, shifting trade, warfare, religious transformation, administrative change, and population movement. What survives in the record suggests a gradual reorientation rather than a single moment when the entire city collapses and its people flee. This gradual quality can be detected in the urban core. Sediment and land use evidence indicates that parts of Angkor were becoming less intensively occupied before the famous military events, often blamed for ending the city. Rather than an abrupt emptying caused solely by invasion, some areas seem to experience reduced use across the 14th century. People may have been moving away from vulnerable or less profitable districts, shifting towards southern centres, reorganising households, or living within a city whose monumental heart remained important even as its wider population thinned. Abandonment does not require panic. It can begin with practical decisions. A family chooses land closer to active trade. Labour obligations no longer bring sufficient benefit. A pond no longer retains enough water. A damaged embankment is not repaired. A wooden house decays after its occupants relocate. Multiply such choices across decades, and the largest low-density city in its world can begin to fade while temples still receive worship and officials still claim authority. Not all of Angkor is ever abandoned in the absolute sense. Angkor Wat, in particular, continues to hold religious significance after the political centre shifts. Buddhist devotion leaves later inscriptions and alterations. Monks, pilgrims, local communities, and caretakers maintain relationships with the site through succeeding centuries. This matters because the popular image of a completely lost jungle city rediscovered by astonished foreigners is deeply misleading. The Khmer people did not forget Angkor. The temples remained part of living cultural and sacred landscapes, even as the huge infrastructure network and widespread residential pattern of the imperial capital declined or became concealed. European visitors later wrote about Angkor, and 19th century accounts helped turn it into an object of global fascination, but they did not rescue it from total absence. What had become obscured was less the existence of the great temples than the astonishing extent of the urban world around them. The concealment is particularly effective because so much of that city was built in materials nature can dismantle quickly. Houses of wood and thatch vanish in humid conditions once no one repairs them. Ponds fill with sediment. Earthen mounds become subtle undulations. Field boundaries blur. Road embankments settle beneath forest or cultivation. Local temples decay unless constructed in durable brick or stone. By contrast, the monumental centres remain. Encouraging later observers to imagine a ceremonial site without realising that countless families once lived across the surrounding plain. Lidar strips away this visual deception. not by physically cutting the trees, but by measuring the contours beneath them. It makes visible the city that weather and vegetation reduced to geometry grids, enclosures, channels, reservoirs, roads, mounds, and hundreds of small interventions made by generations who rarely appear in royal inscriptions. Among the more curious discoveries are patterned embankments and landscape features whose exact functions remain uncertain. Reminders that even a city mapped from the air is not automatically understood. A shape in the earth may indicate cultivation, water control, ritual organisation, construction planning, or an experiment abandoned before completion. The great reservoirs themselves continue to provoke debate about how heavily they were used for irrigation as opposed to water storage. Symbolism, flood management, or combined roles that change through time, Angkor reveals itself dramatically, yet refuses any simple explanation. Its infrastructure is real, its vulnerability to rainfall extremes is well supported, its broader decline is visible, but the daily sequence by which districts emptied, channels failed, authority shifted, and households relocated remains partly hidden beneath precisely the landscape engineering that made the city possible. As maintenance declines, tropical growth moves into spaces once kept open, trees rise from embankments, roots enter galleries and loosen carved stones, monsoon rain continues flowing, but now through a landscape less thoroughly controlled. Laterite blocks tumble, sandstone reliefs wear under moisture, plants, and time. Moats become quiet surfaces reflecting structures built to represent cosmic order, in temple corridors. Dancers carved in stone continue their poised movements, while the communities that once supplied the city have scattered, adapted, and carried Khmer life forward elsewhere. Angkor does not vanish because its civilization vanishes. It becomes a different kind of place, no longer the immense operating centre of empire, but a sacred, inhabited, remembered, weathered landscape surrounded by the faint remains of its former urban scale. There is a particular melancholy in a city whose greatest strength leaves behind evidence of its strain. Angkor's canals and reservoirs are monuments to intelligence, coordination, ambition, and adaptation. They allowed large populations to gather in a challenging monsoon environment and supported a sacred capital of extraordinary achievement. Yet when drought persisted, rains returned with destructive violence. Commerce shifted, political authority changed, and labour no longer sustained the old system. Those same waterworks recorded damage like scars across the earth. The city is buried not under ash or sea, but beneath the consequences of its own vast relationship with water, concealed in the plain until new eyes could trace the channels again. Beyond the humid forests of Cambodia, another form of concealment waits in almost opposite conditions. There, it is not rain and roots that soften the memory of cities, but dryness, abandoned canals, empty caravan roads, and sand moving endlessly before the wind. Across the deserts and oases of Central Asia, urban places once bright with markets, monasteries, fortresses, documents, languages, and long-distance trade would lose the water and movement that sustained them, leaving their walls to be covered by the landscape through which wealth once came. At the edge of a desert, abandonment begins with sound disappearing. A market grows quieter because fewer caravans arrive. A stable keeps fewer animals. A canal carries shallower water through channels that once fed orchards and fields. Courtyards that rang with bargaining, prayer, grinding grain, hammering metal, and the voices of travellers from distant lands begin to collect dust in undisturbed corners. Doors are shut not for the night, but for the last time. Roof beams are removed by people who know wood is too valuable to leave behind. Written records, broken tools, worn sandals, fragments of cloth, food remains, and bundles of documents remain in rooms that no one expects to become archives. Then the wind enters. It moves grains of sand over thresholds, down alleys, against defensive walls, into administrative offices and shrines. It does not need to strike with the violence of ash, nor flood, or fire. It covers the city patiently, season after season, until the place that once connected worlds lies under the very desert its inhabitants had learned, for a time, to cross. The cities of Inner Asia were built within some of the most demanding landscapes ever to support urban life. Between China, India, Iran, the steppe, and the Mediterranean stretched immense regions of mountain, gravel plain, salt basin, oasis, and sand. No single road crossed this world like a paved imperial highway. What is commonly called the Silk Road was a shifting web of routes linking settlements where water, security, pasture, trade, and political permission made movement possible. Travellers did not simply stride across empty deserts carrying silk from one end of Eurasia to the other. Goods passed through many hands: horses, camels, guides, translators, merchants, envoys, monks, soldiers, tax officials, artisans, pilgrims, fugitives, and local brokers moved between oasis towns and regional capitals. At each viable stopping place, geography could become wealth. A settlement with water and protection might grow into a market into a fortified town into a centre of administration, religion, farming, craft production, and international contact. But in an arid world, a city's apparent permanence rests upon something as delicate as water following the right course. Oasis settlements survive because mountain meltwater, rivers, springs, wells, underground channels, or engineered irrigation reach places otherwise too dry for sustained farming. Along the southern margins of the Taklamakan Desert, Rivers descending from high mountains spread life into narrow green zones before vanishing into sand. Here, communities could grow grain, plant orchards, pasture animals, make textiles, collect taxes, house officials, support religious communities, and shelter travellers approaching the enormous desert basin. Beyond irrigated land, dunes and gravel expanses offered little forgiveness. A town's strength came from its position between dangerous distances, yet that also meant it could be undone if the river shifted, if irrigation failed, if political protection weakened, or if merchants found another route. Nia, in the southern Tarim basin of what is now Xinjiang, provides one of the most intimate examples of a city consumed by dryness and silence. Its ancient settlement flourished during the first centuries of the Common Era within the Kingdom of Korena, also known from Chinese sources as Shanshan, a polity positioned along routes connecting China with Central Asia and lands farther west. Nia was not a massive imperial capital in the manner of Rome or Angkor. It was an oasis, administrative and agricultural community, spread along a river corridor extending into the desert, with houses, orchards, fields, Buddhist religious life, official activity, and connections to a wide trading network. Its people lived at a meeting point of cultures. They used materials, objects, artistic influences, administrative practices, and scripts reflecting a world far more connected than the isolation of the surviving ruin suggests. The preservation at Nia is extraordinary because the desert removes moisture from the ordinary work of decay. Wooden beams, furniture fragments, carved architectural elements, textiles, leather, baskets, animal remains, food traces, domestic objects, and documents survive in conditions that would have destroyed them in humid ground. Rooms abandoned more than 1,000 years ago still retain timber posts and fallen rafters silvered by aridity. In places, the shape of household compounds can be followed through walls and courtyards standing among sand and dead vegetation. What would elsewhere become only stains in soil appears here as the tangible equipment of life: a wooden table, a spindle, shoes, pieces of wool, the remains of fruit, implements used by people who did not imagine their ordinary possessions would endure more successfully than their town. Most remarkable are the documents, many written in Kharosthi, a script with origins in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent and used in the administration of this Central Asian kingdom. Written on wooden tablets, sometimes shaped and sealed for official use, they preserve disputes, orders, taxes, property matters, labour, travel arrangements, grain, wine, animals, marriage, inheritance, accusations of theft, and the bureaucratic texture of daily concern. A dead city does not usually surrender so many small voices from its routine administration. Nia's tablets reveal officials trying to maintain authority in a fragile inhabited strip beside the desert. They reveal a society concerned with crops, livestock, obligations, punishment, exchange, and order. They show that a settlement now surrounded by emptiness was once organised enough to produce written instructions and legal records, and connected enough to employ a script carried across immense cultural distance. Buddhism also moved through this world of oasis towns. Monks, images, texts, patrons, and religious buildings followed the same broad networks that carried luxury goods and diplomatic messages. In the Tarim Basin, Buddhist communities became rooted in towns whose survival depended upon trade and irrigation. Religion gave travellers familiar institutions along difficult routes and allowed local elites to participate in wider sacred cultures. The desert today makes these ruins seem separated and forlorn, but in their living period they were stepping stones in a chain of exchanges. A traveller could move from one cultivated refuge to another, hearing different languages and encountering different customs while still recognising the presence of monasteries, officials, markets, animals, and goods moving along routes that linked distant civilizations. Then Nia ceased to function. The exact progression remains uncertain. The river sustaining the settlement may have shifted or diminished, as waterways in the Tarim Basin repeatedly have across history. Irrigated fields require constant maintenance. Once water fails to reach them reliably, farming contracts quickly. Political changes affected the kingdom and its connections. Trade routes altered under changing regional power. A settlement dependent on both local water and long-distance movement could not easily survive when either weakened, and perhaps could not survive at all when both did. By around the 4th century, occupation at Nia had largely come to an end. People took some possessions with them and left others behind. Administrative tablets remained where no official would ever read them again. Orchards died. Reeds and trees dried in former channels. The desert advanced across compounds with no one remaining to clear it away. Sand, in this setting, is less an attacking army than the final clerk of abandonment, filing away the remains of a failed settlement. It fills rooms gently enough to preserve what it conceals. The dryness mummifies fragments of a life that had depended upon water. This contradiction is among the most striking in buried city archaeology Nia survives, because the environmental conditions that finally made sustained occupation impossible also protected its abandoned remains. The river's retreat helped kill the town. The desert's dryness held its records. Archaeologists arriving in the ruined landscape encounter not an urban skeleton stripped down to stone, but an unexpectedly personal archive, a place where brittle documents and domestic timbers make the lost inhabitants feel close enough to have stepped away only recently, though their world disappeared many centuries ago. Far to the west, on the margins of the Karakum Desert in present-day Turkmenistan, the oasis of Merv presents loss on a much grander scale. Here, instead of one abandoned settlement, successive cities rose near the Murghab River over thousands of years, shifting their positions as dynasties, defensive needs, irrigation patterns, and political fortunes changed. Merv occupied a strategic location on routes linking Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and beyond. Its fields depended upon irrigation in an otherwise arid environment. Its prosperity depended upon the ability of rulers and communities to command water, defend routes, tax trade, and draw populations into an oasis that could support extraordinary urban concentration. Over time, Merv became not one city but an archaeological landscape of adjacent ruined centres, walls, citadels, palaces, industrial quarters, religious buildings, mausoleums, streets, and mounds left by different urban eras. Under the Achaemenid Persian Empire, in Hellenistic periods following Alexander's conquests, under Parthian and Sasanian rule, and later under Islamic dynasties, Merv remained a place of importance. Its names and political identity changed, but its location retained enormous value. The oasis supported agriculture while routes brought merchants, armies, officials, scholars, artisans, religious communities, and imperial ambition. By the early Islamic period, and especially under the Seljuks in the 11th and 12th centuries, Merv became one of the great cities of the Eastern Islamic world. It was a centre of power, learning, commerce, architecture, and administration, libraries, mosques, markets, palaces, workshops, gardens, and suburbs belonged to a city whose prosperity would have seemed anything but temporary. The mausoleum of Sultan Sanjar, still rising above the ruins, speaks of a political world confident enough to build forms meant to endure on a monumental scale. Merv's burial is not only a story of sand and water, it is also a story of human violence on an almost unbearable scale. In 1221, during the Mongol campaigns in the region, the city was taken after resistance and political turmoil. Medieval accounts describe slaughter of enormous proportions, though their reported figures are likely exaggerated and cannot be accepted literally. The destruction itself, however, was real and devastating. A major urban centre was assaulted, its population killed. Displaced or dispersed, its institutions broken, its economic life savaged, few events exposed the vulnerability of a wealthy city more brutally than conquest by a force able and willing to annihilate resistance. Granaries, libraries, workshops, mosques, houses, canals, palaces, market networks, and family lives could not be protected by the mere fact that the city had endured for centuries. Prosperity attracted conquerors as surely as it attracted merchants. Yet even after catastrophe, Merv was not erased in one clean ending. Occupation continued in parts of the oasis. Later settlements and communities endured or reformed. This is a pattern repeated across history. Destruction may break an urban centre's power without entirely emptying the landscape. People return to water if water remains. They reuse walls, repair canals, cultivate fields, establish smaller towns, adapt ruins to new purposes, or build beside the remnants of earlier grandeur. But Merv never regained the same position it had held at its height. Political centres shifted. Trade patterns changed. Irrigation systems required labour and stability that repeated upheaval made difficult to sustain. The Murghab and its managed channels remained the basis of life, but a giant urban concentration demanded more than the mere presence of water. It required security, organisation, confidence, and networks reaching far beyond the oasis. Walking the ruins of Merv today means crossing enormous enclosed areas whose emptiness is itself evidence of former scale. City walls run across dry ground. Massive earthworks contain spaces no longer occupied by dense neighbourhoods. Fragments of brickwork emerge from dust. Ceremonial buildings stand isolated in a plain that once contained movement. Gardens, smoke, animals, workshops, voices, and crowded streets. Wind passes across surfaces that human labour once kept repaired and ordered. Unlike Nia, where desert preservation offers intimate records of households and minor officials, Merv overwhelms through magnitude. Its abandoned walled cities reveal how an urban centre can migrate across an oasis, each phase leaving behind a ghostly plan of a world replaced by another, until even the later city becomes ruin. The Silk Road is often remembered through beautiful objects: silk, glass, gemstones, metalwork, manuscripts, painted images, spices, fine ceramics, and the exciting idea of distant cultures meeting across continents. The buried towns tell the cost behind that movement. Caravan cities existed because routes were difficult, water limited, empires unstable, and travellers vulnerable. They depended upon safe passage, functioning wells and canals, political agreements, demand for distant goods, and the presence of communities able to feed and equip people crossing harsh terrain. When war severed routes, when ships offered competing connections, when rivers shifted, when an oasis dried, when an empire fell, or when a conquering army shattered a wealthy centre, the city's purpose could collapse with startling speed. A merchant road is never simply a line through space. It is a chain of trust and necessity, and the failure of one link can leave markets empty far from the event that caused it. Other Central Asian and desert-edge settlements repeat the pattern with local variations. Along the Tarim Basin, towns such as Lulan became associated with shifting waterways and the retreat of habitable conditions. In the sands and dry corridors of western China, Abandoned watchtowers, postal stations, Buddhist sites, cemeteries, documents, and dwellings survive because aridity preserves what thriving life once produced. Farther west, oasis centres rose and suffered under competing empires and armies, sustained only as long as fields could be irrigated and routes remained valuable. Some places were not buried in the literal depth seen at Pompeii, but they were removed from ordinary life so completely that dunes, dust, and eroded mud brick made great settlements almost indistinguishable from the surrounding desert. There is no romance in being the last household to leave an oasis city. By then, the beauty of faraway trade and the prestige of urban history matter less than water and food. A family may hold on because ancestors are buried nearby, because fields have been cultivated for generations, because debts and property tie them to local officials, because migration into another town promises no welcome, or because each failed season may still appear temporary. But as channels dry, salt rises in fields. Orchards cease producing, caravans no longer stop, and abandoned houses begin to shed beams and walls. The city changes from a home into a warning. The desert does not need to chase those who remain. It only needs to wait until the labour maintaining the boundary between settlement and wasteland is no longer sufficient. At Nia, the sand protects wooden letters from officials who could not protect their own town. At Merv, vast walls enclose spaces whose political importance and human density dissolve through conquest, change, and the difficult arithmetic of irrigation. Together they reveal that burial by desert is rarely the story of an irresistible dune sweeping over a thriving city overnight. It is usually the final act of a longer unravelling, when water, trade, safety, and authority no longer align. Yet deserts have always encouraged legends. A ruin half exposed in sand, a lost road, a tale of wealth swallowed by emptiness, a name repeated by travellers who never saw the place themselves. These ingredients invite stories of cities erased in divine punishment or hidden with their treasures intact. Somewhere between the ruined caravan station and the imagined city of riches lies a question that has drawn explorers repeatedly into Arabian sands when people say the desert swallowed a city. How much of the city was ever real, and how much was built from longing, warning, and myth? The desert is especially skilled at turning absence into a story. A line of dunes can hide a wall, but it can also hide the fact that no great wall was ever there. A dried well, a scatter of pottery, the dark trace of an old campfire, or a ruined caravan outpost can grow in memory until it becomes a metropolis of pillars and wealth, destroyed in a night and buried as punishment for pride. In Arabia, where distances are severe and survival historically depended upon water, guidance, hospitality, and remembered roots, tales of lost settlements carry more than entertainment. They speak of the danger of arrogance in a hostile land, the fragility of prosperity, and the unsettling possibility that even a place famous enough to be repeated in sacred or poetic tradition might leave only uncertain marks beneath the sand. Among all such stories, few have attracted more fascination than the search for a place often called Uba, popularly described as the Atlantis of the sands. A vanished Arabian city swallowed by the desert. The phrase is powerful. It's also misleading because the reality behind it is less like a golden capital, entombed intact beneath dunes, and more like a complicated encounter between trade, landscape, textual memory, archaeology, and the modern desire to find a spectacular ruin where older stories left room for one. Southern Arabia was never simply empty sand. Across what are now Oman and Yemen, communities learned to live within landscapes shaped by mountains, monsoon influence, dry valleys, springs, wells, seasonal movement, and routes connecting the interior with the coast and lands beyond the sea. Most famously, this region formed part of the ancient trade in aromatic resins, especially frankincense. Harvested from trees that grow in particular environments along the southern Arabian margin and the Horn of Africa, frankincense was far more than pleasant smoke. In many ancient societies it carried ritual, social, and economic value. It burned in temples, accompanied offerings, perfumed elite spaces, entered funerary practices, and travelled through networks linking Arabia with Mediterranean, Near Eastern, Indian Ocean, and African markets. A small piece of fragrant resin could begin its journey in rugged southern terrain and end in a sanctuary palace or household far beyond the horizon of the people who gathered it. That trade encouraged movement through difficult country. Resin had to be collected, sorted, stored, taxed, carried, protected, exchanged, and transported across land or by sea. Camel caravans could cross stretches inaccessible to ordinary farming communities, but not without dependable knowledge of water and stopping points. Caravan routes are often imagined as fixed roads drawn neatly across deserts, yet in reality they changed with security, weather, politics, market demand, the condition of wells, rival authorities, and available transport. A stopping place did not need to be a magnificent city to matter enormously. A fortified water source, a small settlement with storage space, an administrative station, or an oasis able to provision travellers could become vital within a chain of movement. Its importance to caravans might later expand its reputation far beyond its physical size. The name Ubar has been connected in modern popular culture with the Quranic account of Iram, associated with the people of Ad, a proud and powerful community destroyed after rejecting warnings. Interpretations of these traditions are complex, and the connection between a specific archaeological place and the legendary or scriptural descriptions is far from proven. in Arabic literary and geographical traditions, names, regions, tribes. And imagine ruins can overlap in ways that do not map neatly onto one buried city. Sometimes Iram has been understood as a people, sometimes a place, sometimes a magnificent city, and sometimes an emblem of vanished arrogance. Ubar itself has been applied variously to a region, a route, or a legendary settlement. The modern expectation that one can locate the exact coordinates of a city from a layered tradition may say as much about present-day treasure hunting instincts as it does about ancient geography. Even so, the search has a genuine archaeological background. In the late 20th century, attention turned to a site at Shisar in Oman, near the edge of the vast Rub al-Khali, the Empty Quarter. This is a landscape with a name suited to legend immense, difficult, visually overwhelming, and capable of making human occupation appear temporary even where it has persisted in ingenious forms. Remote sensing imagery helped researchers identify traces interpreted as ancient routes converging in the area, raising the possibility that Shisar had functioned as a significant stopping point in the frankincense trade. Excavation revealed a fortified site surrounding a water source, with walls, towers, evidence of occupation, and a dramatic collapsed portion where the ground had fallen into a cavity beneath the settlement. Here was the essential material of a gripping discovery. Caravan tracks, a desert fort, a well, frankincense connections, and part of the site apparently swallowed by the earth. News reports and documentaries quickly transformed Shisar into the discovered lost city of Ubar. The appeal was immediate. The desert had given up a secret. Satellite technology had found what generations of travellers had only imagined. A legendary city had collapsed into sand, matching ancient warnings about wealth and destruction. Yet the archaeology demands greater restraint. Shisar is real and significant. It appears to have been associated with movement through the region and may have served as a water stop, fortified settlement, trading station, or administrative point connected in some manner with frankincense routes. Its collapse is also real, likely connected to the failure of limestone beneath structures around the well, perhaps worsened by repeated water extraction and long use. But nothing discovered there establishes it as a vast opulent city of the kind evoked in popular retellings. Its scale is modest. Its ruins do not reveal avenues of a desert metropolis or a capital buried whole in dunes. The evidence suggests an important small site in a larger economic landscape, not an Arabian Pompeii awaiting rediscovery. This distinction does not make Shisar disappointing. It makes it more human. A water source on the margin of terrible dryness can be more important than a palace, because every traveller and animal crossing the route depends upon it. A fortified outpost can accumulate goods, information, authority, conflict, and memory disproportionate to its walls. Men guiding laden camels through shimmering distances may have regarded such a stop not as an architectural wonder, but as relief itself shade. Water. Exchange, news, calculation of the next journey. Its towers could protect supplies or signal control of the well. Resin moving through its vicinity could connect sparse stone structures with temples and markets thousands of miles away. If the site failed when the ground collapsed around its water source, that failure would have appeared devastating to those whose routes depended upon it. A ruined stopping place in the desert might naturally become larger in memory, particularly once the network that gave it importance had changed. The frankincense trade itself was never controlled by one mysterious lost city. Archaeological and historical evidence points instead to multiple production zones, ports, inland settlements, caravan routes, kingdoms, intermediaries, and changing forms of transport. Sites in southern Arabia, including the region of Dhofar, the Hadramaut, and the ancient South Arabian kingdoms farther west, formed parts of complex systems over long periods. Ports connected aromatic goods to Indian Ocean shipping. Overland routes linked production and exchange centres toward markets in Arabia and the Mediterranean. Cities such as Shabwa, associated with the Kingdom of Hadramaut, and other South Arabian centres show that the wealth of incense could support urban and political development, taxation, monumental building, and long-distance contact. But that history is not improved by forcing every ruin into the shape of one legendary vanished capital. Trade landscapes are usually networks, not singular secrets. Legends of sudden destruction often grow around a truth that is slower and less theatrical. A water supply fails. A route becomes unnecessary after maritime trade expands or political conditions shift. A fortified station loses the reason travellers once depended upon it. A limestone sinkhole collapses part of a settlement. Windblown sand begins to collect against walls already abandoned. Later travellers see ruins but do not know precisely who built them or why they are empty. Stories explain the silence. A rich people became proud. A warning was ignored. The ground swallowed them. Their prosperity disappeared because no human achievement can stand against judgment, fate, or the desert. These explanations are not archaeological reports, but neither are they meaningless. They preserve moral memory, environmental anxiety, and the recognition that water and wealth in Arabia have always been precarious companions. There are other reasons lost city stories flourish in deserts. Visibility is deceptive. In forest, ruins hide behind vegetation. In dry lands, they appear exposed, as though everything should be easy to find. Yet deserts bury, scour, scatter, and imitate human forms. Wind removes one surface and deposits another. Mud brick walls erode until they resemble natural ridges. Temporary camps leave little architecture. Routes vanish when wells fail. Aerial or satellite imagery can reveal alignments and trackways. but it can also encourage overinterpretation of patterns whose dates and functions remain uncertain until investigated on the ground. Archaeologists must separate recent vehicle tracks from old caravan movement, geological features from structures, isolated occupations from continuous urban sites, and genuine trade evidence from an attractive story already circulating before excavation begins. The desert offers clarity of horizon, not necessarily clarity of past. Popular theories sometimes reach far beyond the evidence, proposing that Ubar was an immense technologically advanced city, a treasury lost intact under dunes, or a direct historical original for all stories of Iram and divine destruction. Such claims remain unsupported. Archaeology has not revealed a buried desert supercity matching those images. What it has revealed is subtler and better grounded settlements, forts, wells, ports, caravan routes, incense-producing regions, and urban kingdoms that demonstrate how southern Arabia participated in long-distance economic and cultural worlds. Scholars still debate the interpretation of individual sites and the shifting relationship between traditional names and physical remains. But the evidence does not require a single vanished metropolis to make the region remarkable. The real achievement was sustaining movement, settlement, and trade across environments where every journey depended upon precise local knowledge, and every prosperous centre rested on vulnerable supplies of water. The search for Ubar also reveals how deeply modern discovery narratives prefer a moment of triumph. There is a powerful appeal in announcing that a legendary city has been found, particularly when remote sensing, exploration, and excavation appear to unite technology with ancient mystery. A careful conclusion that a fortified oasis site may have been connected to caravan traffic, and later inspired or become attached to broader traditions, cannot compete easily with the phrase "lost city discovered." But buried city archaeology is filled with such tensions. Pompeii truly is a city sealed by eruption, yet even there the final moments are more complicated than popular memory allows. Akrotiri is genuinely buried by volcanic disaster, yet its people are missing and its wider consequences debated. Maya cities are concealed beneath forests, yet their descendants never vanished. Angkor is monumental and partly reclaimed by vegetation, yet it remained known and sacred. Shissa does not need to be the legendary city of pillars to belong within this family of places where landscape, memory, and human longing have reshaped what disappearance means. Imagine the site not through the expectation of treasure, but through its last practical days. The well has long been the reason for stopping. Animals approach exhausted from dry travel. Resin, provisions, ropes, hides, vessels, and weapons pass through the enclosure. News moves from caravan to caravan, a route unsafe, a ruler demanding tax, a market paying well, a dry stretch more dangerous than usual. Then perhaps the water becomes less dependable, or cracks widen near the central source. Or a structural collapse damages part of the place with shocking suddenness. Perhaps occupation contracts, perhaps travellers choose alternatives, perhaps the station remains useful for a while after its damage. Eventually the repairs are no longer made. Sand enters spaces once guarded, the well becomes a feature in a ruin. Those who later hear of the place may know only that something valuable once stood there and was swallowed from below. The transformation from vulnerable outpost to lost city is not fraud or foolishness alone. It is the way memory enlarges places whose purpose has outlived the details of their walls. And the greatest irony is that Arabia contains genuinely impressive ancient urban histories needing no invention. Irrigation systems made desert-edge agriculture flourish. Monumental temples and cities rose through South Arabian kingdoms, whose inscriptions testify to rulers, gods, wars, alliances, and trade. Ports on the Arabian Sea and Red Sea connected regional products with worlds beyond. Frankincense trees rooted in dry hills helped produce wealth that travelled into imperial rituals and sacred spaces far away. A humble caravan station, a collapsed well, or an eroded fort is part of that history, because cities do not survive on monuments alone. They survive on routes, pauses, water, storage, trust, and the small reliable places between major destinations. In the empty quarter, the horizon can erase scale. A person standing among ruined stones sees dunes, heat, silence, and the remains of a place no longer protected by need. It is easy to understand why stories grow there. The desert seems able to consume anything, and a civilization aware of its own fragility will always be drawn to tales of cities lost beneath it. Yet sand is not the only landscape that can hide prosperity, nor is dry burial the only condition that turns streets into mystery. Beyond the caravan routes and vanished wells, along unstable shorelines and low deltas, cities faced an opposite fate. Instead of losing water, they received too much of it. Their temples, quays, houses, and markets did not fade behind dunes. They descended beneath waves, where silence is heavier, excavations slower, and entire streets can remain waiting in dark water beneath the roots of passing boats. Water hides a city differently from ash, forest, or sand. Ash settles from above and locks rooms in a sudden mineral darkness. Roots pry architecture apart while leaving broken towers visible between leaves. Sand moves across abandoned thresholds and turns streets into dunes. But the sea removes the ordinary terms by which a city is recognised. A road can remain intact beneath several metres of water and no longer be a road to anyone living above it. A harbour wall can survive precisely where it was built, yet become invisible beneath waves crossed daily by fishing boats. Columns fall into silt, roof tiles scatter among shells, anchors lie beside buildings that once served sailors on dry land, and the boundary between ruin and seabed becomes so complete that generations may pass without realizing that below, the water lies not a wreck, not a few isolated stones, but the remains of an inhabited place. A drowned city has not always been carried away. Sometimes the land has simply lowered, the sea has risen, or both have shifted enough that the city remains in place while the world around it changes category. People have always gathered near water because water opens possibilities no inland wall can replace. Coasts provide fish, salt, transport, sheltered landing places, foreign trade, naval power, river access, fertile deltas, and the possibility that goods moving across vast distances will enter through one controlled edge of land. A harbour can make a modest settlement wealthy far beyond the productivity of its immediate fields. Warehouses rise near quays, temples receive offerings from travellers. Inns, workshops, markets, customs officials, sailors, labourers, merchants, and translators gather around the rhythm of arrival and departure. In river deltas, channels connect farmland and sea, bringing grain outward and imported goods inward. Yet coastal success depends upon a landscape that is never still. Shorelines migrate. Rivers deposit silt and then abandon channels. Storms cut through barriers that seemed permanent. Earthquakes lower whole districts or tilt the ground enough for waves to invade them. Soft delta mud compresses beneath the weight of buildings. Tsunamis erase harbour edges. Slow sea level rise advances through streets so gradually that no single resident witnesses a dramatic drowning, only an increasingly difficult effort to hold land against water. The Mediterranean preserves numerous reminders that the shorelines of antiquity are not the shorelines of today. Roman roads end beneath shallow seas. Fish tanks, quays, villas, harbour works, mosaics, and warehouses now stand partly or wholly underwater. At Baiae, on the Bay of Naples, the fate is almost perversely fitting. This was a resort landscape of the Roman elite, famous for luxurious villas, baths, seaside pleasure, and a reputation for indulgence that moralizing writers found difficult to resist. The same volcanic region that created warm springs and made the area attractive also made the ground unstable. Baiae lies within the restless zone of the Campi Flegrei, where the crust can rise and fall through a process now known as bradycism, driven by changes within the volcanic system beneath the surface. Over centuries, parts of the ancient shoreline sank. Floors once crossed by wealthy residents now lie beneath clear coastal water. Mosaic pavements can be viewed underwater. Columns and walls stand in a drowned architectural world where fish move through rooms once designed for feasting, bathing, and displaying status. Baiae was not suddenly destroyed in one terrible day like Pompeii. Though earthquakes and volcanic instability affected the region, its submergence demonstrates a quieter form of urban loss. A shoreline can fail by increments. At first, perhaps certain waterfront structures flood more often. Repairs become necessary. The useful edge of a harbour changes. Saltwater damages surfaces never meant to remain submerged. People adapt, withdraw, rebuild elsewhere, reuse what remains. And gradually abandoned space is no longer worth defending. Long afterward, the drowned remains appear almost dreamlike, as if a complete city slid gently beneath the bay. The reality is more prosaic and more unsettling land considered valuable, fashionable, and heavily built upon could be reclaimed by water because the ground beneath generations of confidence was moving. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean, earthquake and wave action can alter a harbour in a far more violent interval. The submerged remains associated with ancient Epidaurus in Greece preserve foundations close to shore, likely belonging to a Roman-era settlement or villa complex rather than a great lost capital. Yet their visibility beneath shallow water makes the drowned pass startlingly immediate. On a calm day, walls appear through the surface as geometric forms below the sea. Proof that only a slight change in level can remove an inhabited structure from ordinary use. Along parts of the Adriatic, Aegean, and Levantine coasts, submerged installations and coastal ruins preserve similar evidence of ancient communities built at the edge of a shifting line. Archaeology must be cautious here. Not every stone underwater marks a lost town. Some are harbour installations, collapsed buildings, quarries, fish ponds, ship ballast, or structures altered by centuries of coastal use. The phrase drowned city attracts attention, but the evidence often reveals a more complicated coastal landscape in which homes, industrial spaces, ceremonial buildings, roads, docks, and sea defences were affected differently through time. One of the most remarkable submerged prehistoric landscapes lies far from marble harbours and Roman villas, off the coast of the eastern Mediterranean near modern Israel. At Atlit Yam, beneath the sea, archaeologists identified a Neolithic settlement dating back thousands of years before the classical cities usually associated with underwater archaeology. There are stone-built features, human burials, traces of houses, wells, and a striking arrangement of upright stones around what appears to have been a freshwater source. The people who lived there inhabited a coastline still adjusting after the great melting of ice sheets at the end of the last ice age, when global sea levels were rising and low-lying coastal lands across the world were gradually being inundated. Atlit Yam offers a rare view of a community at the boundary between land and encroaching sea, long before written records. Its inhabitants did not build monumental temples or royal warehouses, yet the drowned settlement reveals that the loss of coastal home ground is older than cities themselves. Before kings carved their names in stone, families were already living in places that the sea would later erase from the visible landscape. The flooding of such early settlements was not necessarily experienced as a dramatic event in a single lifetime. Sea level rise can be slow by human perception, advancing across generations, changing marshes, springs, fishing grounds, soils, and the location of the shore. But slow does not mean harmless. A small rise in water can contaminate a freshwater source with salt, drown productive lowland, increase storm damage, or force households to move repeatedly inland. A child might grow up hearing that the old shoreline lay beyond the shallows, where grandparents once walked or gathered food. In many parts of the world, prehistoric coastlines now lie underwater because the ocean rose enormously after the last glacial maximum. Countless camps, villages, hunting grounds, ritual places, and burial sites likely remain beyond modern shores, difficult to locate and costly to investigate. The map of early human life is therefore incomplete not only because time destroys evidence on land, but because some of the most attractive environments people occupied are now submerged beneath continental shelves and coastal seas. Off the southern coast of Greece, the submerged site of Pavlopetri brings the shape of a drowned town into extraordinary focus. Lying in shallow water near Laconia, it preserves streets, building outlines, courtyards, tombs, and open areas associated with a settlement whose occupation extends back into the Bronze Age. Unlike a few fallen columns or an isolated harbour wall, Pavlopetri reveals something recognisably urban, a plan through which people moved, organised space, buried their dead, managed households, and participated in the maritime world of the Aegean. The settlement appears to have been submerged through a combination of geological change and sea level effects, perhaps involving earthquake-related subsidence. Its streets are no longer walked, but their arrangement remains legible from above and underwater, a ghostly grid pressed into the seabed. Pavlopetri is especially powerful because it belongs to the same broad maritime world in which islands, coastal towns, palaces, ships, and trade-linked Bronze Age communities across the Aegean. The sea that served as road, resource, and connector eventually covered part of that inhabited coastline. There is no surviving account of residents watching the water take the settlement. There is no exact final day to reconstruct, and no certainty that the town was still fully occupied when submergence occurred. Archaeologists can map structures and study pottery, tombs, and chronology, but the human transition from lived town to abandoned shoreline remains elusive. What survives in the record suggests not a single legendary sinking, but the vulnerability of coastal communities whose prosperity depended upon access to a sea capable of changing the ground beneath them. Farther east, off the coast of India, underwater remains have repeatedly drawn claims of drowned ancient cities, sometimes responsibly investigated and sometimes expanded into stories far beyond what archaeological context can support. Coastal India has long histories of ports, temples, trade settlements, river mouths, storms, shoreline change, and sea level movement. At Mahabalipuram on the Bay of Bengal, traditions of submerged temples existed before modern investigations identified structural remains offshore and coastal features altered by the sea. The surviving monuments on land, carved and built during the Pallava period, stand close enough to the waves to make the idea of further lost structures compelling. After the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004 temporarily withdrew water and disturbed coastal sands, additional archaeological features became visible in the region, reminding observers that the coastline had concealed evidence of older human construction. Yet the romantic image of an entire fabulous city drowned intact must be treated carefully. Shoreline architecture can be damaged, scattered, submerged, exposed, and reburied through many processes, and a tradition may preserve a genuine memory of loss without providing a precise map of what lies underwater. Similar caution surrounds discoveries and claims in the Gulf of Kambat and near Dwarka, where submerged features have sometimes been linked in popular accounts to extremely ancient cities or to legendary urban centres described in later religious tradition. Underwater archaeology in such environments is difficult. Currents move material, river systems deposit and redeposit objects, stone formations may be natural or modified. Artefacts dredged without secure context are hard to use for dating structures. Ports can occupy the same coastline across widely separated eras. There is a real history in India's submerged coastal landscapes trade, settlement, changing shorelines, storms, religious traditions, and marine archaeology all matter, but scholars still debate many interpretations. And unsupported claims of impossibly ancient advanced cities do not become reliable merely because the sea makes direct investigation challenging. Water encourages imagination, partly because it conceals the evidence needed to limit it. In some places, cities drown not through gradual global sea level rise or uncertain coastal legends, but because deltas themselves are treacherous foundations. River mouths produce wealth through fertile soil and trade, yet their sediments are soft, waterlogged, shifting, and easily compressed. Channels move, floods redistribute silt, buildings add weight. Earthquakes can cause saturated ground to lose strength in moments, making structures tilt, collapse, or settle. Storm waves enter low districts. A settlement at a delta outlet may be commercially perfect and geologically vulnerable at the same time. The Nile Delta is one of the greatest examples of this contradiction. For millennia it has been a landscape of river branches, marsh, farmland, lagoons, coastal bars, harbours, temples, towns, and routes connecting Egypt's interior with the Mediterranean. Whoever controlled access through its channels could participate in the wealth of one of the ancient world's richest civilizations. Whoever built there also placed stone, wood, people, warehouses, shrines, and ships upon ground continually shaped by water. Underwater excavation changes the rhythm of discovery. On land, soil can be removed square by square while walls gradually emerge into air. Beneath water, visibility may collapse with one careless movement through silt. Objects must be recorded in conditions of buoyancy, current, darkness, corrosion, marine growth, and limited working time. Stone statues can be immense and fragile in different ways from those buried on dry ground. Wood may survive because oxygen-poor mud protected it, but begin deteriorating once exposed. A ship buried in silt can reveal commerce, construction, cargo, and navigation, but only through slow and meticulous work. Underwater sites also resist the satisfying illusion that a city can be fully uncovered and walked again. Much must remain submerged, studied through mapping, careful lifting of selected objects, and the acceptance that the sea will continue to hold most of the place in silence. And sometimes that silence is broken by a face rising from mud. Near the mouths of the Nile, divers have found colossal stone figures, inscribed slabs, temple remains, anchors, coins, ritual objects, ceramics, and wrecked ships in areas where ancient people once approached gods and customs officials by boat. Here was not merely a coast overtaken by water, but a gateway city through which foreign merchants entered Egypt, where sacred ceremony stood beside international commerce, and where the instability of delta ground eventually carried entire monumental spaces beneath the Mediterranean. Its name survived in fragments of ancient writing, and in confusion with another nearby centre, but its physical scale remained hidden until underwater archaeology began assembling the pieces. Beneath the silt of Abukir Bay, the drowned city of Thonis Heraclean was waiting, its fallen temples and ships preserving the moment when Egypt met the sea. For centuries, the city existed in text more clearly than it existed in the landscape. Greek writers refer to Heraclean, a port associated with the mouth of the Nile, with temples, trade, and stories linking it to famous figures of the heroic past. Egyptian evidence preserved the name Thonis, a place connected with customs, religious authority, and access to the country through the western reaches of the delta, for a long time. Scholars debated whether Thonis and Heraclean were separate neighbouring settlements, twin ports serving related functions, or different names for the same city seen through Egyptian and Greek traditions. The physical city itself offered little help because it was no longer visible where a city should have been. Its streets were not buried beneath modern construction. Its temples were not standing as weathered ruins beside cultivated fields. They lay beneath the waters of Abukir Bay, off Egypt's Mediterranean coast, submerged in a shallow but difficult underwater landscape of silt, currents, scattered stone, broken architecture, and deposits thick enough to conceal monuments once large enough to define a sacred and commercial gateway to the Nile. The Nile Delta has always rewarded those able to navigate its complexity. Before the river reaches the Mediterranean, it divides into branches, marshes, canals, lagoons, shifting banks, and coastal openings whose importance can change as water and sediment reshape the terrain. In antiquity, vessels approaching from the Mediterranean needed controlled routes into Egypt. Foreign merchants did not simply sail wherever they pleased along the river system. Goods had to be inspected, taxed, transferred, recorded, and brought under the supervision of authorities who understood that access to the Nile meant access to immense agricultural wealth and one of the richest states of the ancient world. Thonis Heraclean flourished because it stood at precisely that threshold. Before Alexandria rose to dominate Egyptian Mediterranean trade, this port was one of the principal points where ships, merchandise, travellers, officials, ritual processions, and foreign communities entered the orbit of pharaonic Egypt. Its importance was both practical and sacred. At the centre of the city stood a major temple dedicated to Amun of Gereb, a form of the god connected with kingship, legitimacy, and the religious landscape of the Delta. This was not an ornamental sanctuary placed beside a harbour as an afterthought. Religion and commerce met closely in ancient ports. Sailors made offerings for safe passage. Rulers required divine recognition. Foreign visitors encountered the authority of Egypt not only through officials collecting dues, but through monumental temples presenting the gods and institutions that governed the land. Thonis Heraclean participated in ceremonies linked with nearby Canopus and with Osiris, whose myth of death, dismemberment, restoration, and renewal carried particular power in a country formed by the annual life-giving cycles of the Nile. Sacred barges moved through waterways during festivals. Priests, offerings, images of gods, musicians, administrators, and spectators transformed canals and harbour basins into ceremonial routes. A city of ships and taxes was also a city of incense, ritual vessels, processions, sacred water, and divine presence. This double identity is written into the objects later recovered from the seabed. Underwater archaeologists have brought to light colossal statues of Egyptian deities and royal figures, heavy stone presences that once stood upright in temple precincts before falling into the silt. One immense figure represents Hapi, the divine embodiment of the Nile's inundation and abundance, holding an offering table. His presence especially appropriate in a city whose existence depended upon the meeting of river and sea. Statues of a pharaoh and a queen, carved on a similarly monumental scale, speak of royal authority entering the sacred environment. Smaller bronze figurines, ritual instruments, stone fragments, jewellery, ceramics, and offerings reflect the continuous devotional life that took place around grand architecture. Among the most important finds is a large inscribed stela discovered underwater, whose decree confirmed that the Egyptian place called Thonis was indeed the city Greeks knew as Herakleion. A long scholarly uncertainty, preserved because the city itself had vanished from sight, was answered by a monument that had fallen with it. The city did not merely receive worshippers, it received cargo. Excavations have identified coins, weights, anchors, pottery, storage vessels, and the remains of an extraordinary number of ancient ships. More than 60 shipwrecks and abandoned vessels have been recorded in the wider submerged site, revealing harbour activity on a scale rarely preserved so clearly. Some were probably commercial vessels, others may have served local transport, ceremonial functions, or work within the delta channels. Among them are boats constructed in ways that echo descriptions left by the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about Egyptian rivercraft made with distinctive plank arrangements and internal supports. For centuries, his account seemed unusual enough to raise uncertainty over how accurately he had understood what he saw. The remains of a vessel from Thonis Herakleion, often called Ship 17, demonstrated striking similarities to his description, offering a rare case in which a buried boat allows an ancient author's technical observation to be tested against archaeology. A drowned port had preserved not only trade, but a solution to a small and stubborn historical question. The harbour must once have been crowded. Imagine ships approaching through channels marked by local knowledge and administrative control, hulls riding low with wine, metals, timber, luxury goods, ceramics, or products intended for Egyptian markets. Egyptian grain, papyrus, linen, crafted goods, and other commodities moved outward. Crews waited for permission, supplies, or favourable conditions. Officials recorded shipments and imposed taxes. Translators negotiated between languages. Labourers carried jars, bundles, sacks, timber, ropes, and equipment between ships and storage areas. Priests prepared sacred vessels for festivals in the same watery environment, where merchants argued over cargo. Greek presence in the city appears to have been substantial, especially as Greek merchants and settlers became increasingly important in Egypt during the first millennium BCE. Yet Thonis Herakleion remained thoroughly Egyptian in its sacred foundations and administrative role. It was not a foreign enclave replacing local culture, but a threshold city where identities, goods, and authority met under Egyptian control. A decree issued by the pharaoh Nectanebo I in the 4th century BCE gives a particularly sharp glimpse of this arrangement. It ordered that a share of taxes levied on goods arriving through the Sea of the Greeks at Thonis, along with a portion of goods produced at Naucratis, should go to the temple of Neith at Sais. The decree survives in more than one monument, one discovered at Naucratis and another recovered from the waters at Thonis Herakleion. Its importance is difficult to overstate. It confirms the city's name, its customs function, its relationship with Greek maritime trade, and the way religious institutions received wealth through the machinery of international commerce. Behind the romance of submerged statues lies a highly organised economic world. Ships arriving from abroad were not simply signs of cosmopolitan wonder, they were taxable movements of value, monitored by a state and directed in part toward powerful temples. For several centuries, this position made the port essential. Then the political and commercial geography of the region changed. In 331 BCE, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria farther west along the Mediterranean coast. Under the Ptolemaic rulers who followed him, Alexandria became one of the greatest cities in the ancient world royal capital, harbour complex, intellectual centre, commercial hub, and Mediterranean face of Egypt on an enormous scale. Its rise did not cause Thonis Herakleion to vanish immediately. Older ports can continue serving trade, local movement, religious functions, and regional networks even after a new metropolis eclipses them. Ritual life at Thonis Herakleion remained significant, and its waterways and temples did not become irrelevant overnight. But the city no longer stood unrivaled at Egypt's maritime gate. Traffic, investment, royal attention, and administrative gravity increasingly centred on Alexandria. A city built around access can survive competition only while enough movement still chooses its channels. Decline in importance did not by itself place temples beneath the sea. For that, the physical instability of the delta mattered. Thonis Herakleion stood on water-saturated ground composed of sediments shaped by river and coast. Such land can support substantial construction for centuries, especially when maintained and understood by those using it. But it remains vulnerable. Heavy stone temples and statues impose pressure upon soft deposits. Earthquakes can cause saturated soils to lose strength through liquefaction, behaving temporarily less like solid ground and more like unstable slurry. Gradual subsidence can lower districts little by little. Changes in river branches and sediment supply can alter protection from marine action. Exceptional floods, storm effects, tidal movement, and rising relative sea levels can further damage structures already weakened by sinking foundations. In this setting, the city did not need one mythical wave to drown it intact. Its disappearance could unfold through repeated episodes in which ground failed, buildings collapsed, water entered formerly secure zones, and increasingly large sections became impossible to use. The bottom of Abukir Bay preserves signs of such failure. Monumental stones lie toppled in ways consistent with collapsed temple structures. Architectural remains are scattered through zones that once formed urban and sacred precincts. The terrain beneath the city shows areas of subsidence and geological instability. Scholars still debate the precise chronology and combination of events that lowered the settlement. Because drowned cities rarely provide a single clean layer explaining every stage. Some destruction may have occurred through powerful earthquakes and related ground failure, some through gradual sinking, some through erosion, and later water action after abandonment had already begun. By late antiquity, large portions of the city were submerged, and by the early medieval period the remaining visible urban presence had effectively disappeared beneath the bay. The port that once controlled ships entering Egypt became a seabed landscape, above which later vessels passed without needing to know the streets below. The sinking must have changed life incrementally before it ended it completely. A temple precinct does not become unusable the moment one paving stone settles unevenly. A key can be repaired, a building can be rebuilt on altered foundations. A sacred object can be relocated if a sanctuary is damaged. Merchants can adapt to a new landing place. Households can move inland. Officials can redirect activity. But repeated damage changes the calculation. If a district floods more frequently, if channels become unreliable, if a rival port already offers greater commercial advantage, if temples require costly restoration, and if political priorities have shifted elsewhere, a city loses not only ground but the will and resources needed to defend it. A sinking city may appear to those living through its decline, not as one dramatic loss but as a sequence of retreats. A street abandoned here, a harbour installation unusable there, a sanctuary restored once and then finally left. A population reduced until no one remains with enough reason to rebuild upon unstable mud. Underwater preservation is generous in some respects and merciless in others. Heavy stone statues can survive where lighter buildings vanish. Anchors remain after the ships that used them have been consumed or scattered. Unless burial in protective sediment saves portions of hulls, gold survives brilliantly, iron corrodes, organic remains endure only under favourable conditions. Inscribed stone speaks clearly about official matters, while entire neighbourhoods of poorer inhabitants may be difficult to identify. The recovered grandeur of Thonis Heracleion therefore risks making it look like a city composed solely of gods, pharaohs, decrees, and ships. Yet every ceremonial object required handlers, every customs levy involved clerks, guards, sailors, porters, merchants, and warehouse workers. Every temple festival drew cooks, boatmen, craftsmen, musicians, cleaners, devotees, and families watching from the edges of waterways. Somewhere among the broken pottery, weights, domestic fragments, tools, coins, and ordinary architecture lies the less visible population that made the famous gateway function day after day. Its rediscovery began not with a single statue lifted in triumph, but through patient underwater survey in waters known to contain historical remains. Beginning near the end of the 20th century, teams working under the direction of underwater archaeologist Frank Goddio mapped the submerged landscape and identified the city's monuments, inscriptions, artifacts, harbour features, and vessels. The work demanded a form of archaeology unlike the exposure of streets of Pompeii. Mud hid structures and then clouded visibility as soon as it was disturbed. Finds had to be located, recorded, lifted, conserved, and interpreted within a city whose plan was not open beneath sunlight, but fragmented across a watery plain. Magnetic and geophysical survey, diving, careful excavation, conservation, and comparison with text gradually transformed scattered underwater remains into a recognisable urban place. The drowned gateway returned not because the sea receded, but because its submerged pieces were patiently mapped into meaning. The discoveries changed more than one map. They clarified that Thonis and Heracleion were one city known through different cultural traditions. They illuminated Egyptian management of Greek trade before Alexandria's ascendancy. They exposed the scale of navigation, harbour life, and sacred practice in the Nile Delta. They demonstrated the archaeological value of ancient textual details, such as the boat construction described by Herodotus, without requiring that every ancient story be accepted uncritically. Most of all, they revealed a form of urban disappearance in which prosperity and vulnerability occupied exactly the same ground. Thonis Heracleion mattered because it stood where river and sea met. It drowned because river and sea met there on unstable earth. There is a profound sadness in the fall of a temple beneath water. Volcanic ash closes a sanctuary in darkness, but the building remains enclosed within land. At Thonis Heracleion, sacred architecture descended into a medium that continued moving over it. Waves rolled above fallen statues. Fish crossed precincts once purified for divine ceremony. Silt accumulated inside spaces where offerings had been presented and taxes recorded. Ships of later centuries sailed over older ships, unaware that beneath them lay anchors from a port whose officials once regulated entry into Egypt. A city built to receive arrivals became unreachable except by descent. Yet the water that concealed it did not erase every voice. A decree still names the place. A colossal god of the Nile rises again from the sediment that covered his city. A vessel hidden in mud confirms a boat-building tradition observed by an ancient traveller. The drowned stones show not a fantasy city lost outside history, but a real port caught inside the forces that govern so many human settlements' trade: state power, sacred authority, environmental instability, rivalry with newer centres, and the expensive impossibility of holding ground forever. But some cities are not surrendered to the elements after commerce fades or land collapses. Some are intentionally broken while still resisting. their walls breached by soldiers, their buildings burned by conquerors, their people killed, enslaved, dispersed, or forced to build over the ruins of those defeated before them. Beneath many ancient streets, the layer that seals an older city is not ash or silt, but destruction ordered by human hands. A city can be buried by those who hate it, envy it, fear it, or simply need its ground for themselves. Long before ash closes a doorway or silt enters a harbour, armies have understood that urban destruction is a form of power. To break a city is to do more than capture buildings. It is to shatter the confidence of people who believed walls, gods, rulers, wealth, ancestry, and accumulated labour would protect them. Gates are burned, roofs collapse in fire, storehouses are emptied. Temples are stripped or desecrated. Archives vanish into flame. Survivors are killed, enslaved, deported, taxed by a new authority, or scattered into landscapes where their former identity becomes difficult to maintain. Later, another settlement may rise above the destruction, its houses resting directly upon blackened floors and fallen walls. In the ground, the defeated city becomes a layer charcoal, broken weapons, smashed pottery, collapsed brick, scattered valuables left in panic. Bodies denied ordinary burial. What nature may accomplish without intention, human beings have repeatedly done with purpose. The ancient world is crowded with cities destroyed in war, yet archaeology rarely allows a simple story of one army arriving, one fire burning, and one civilization ending. Burning can come from accident, internal struggle, ritual clearance, earthquake damage followed by fire or conquest. A layer of smashed objects may represent plunder, sudden flight, later disturbance, or the normal breakage of centuries compressed by excavation. Written sources may celebrate a victory with theatrical exaggeration, claiming that a ruler annihilated a city whose population later returned, or whose destruction was far less complete than propaganda suggested. Victors write endings confidently. Soil is less obedient. Scholars must compare inscriptions, dates, weapon marks, human remains, collapsed structures, stored goods abandoned in place, regional political changes, and signs of rebuilding before concluding that a violent destruction layer belongs to the war history later texts describe. Even when the evidence is clear, conquest does not always erase urban life. A captured city is valuable precisely because it already possesses walls, water, roads, fields, labour, workshops, temples, harbours, and symbolic importance. An attacker may prefer to occupy it, tax it, install officials, seize elite property, and redirect its sacred spaces rather than reduce everything to useless rubble. Destruction is most complete when a city is made an example, when resistance is punished, when rival power must be eliminated, when control requires mass displacement, or when the invading force has little interest in preserving the defeated urban system. At other times, devastation falls selectively. Palace burned, defences dismantled, temple treasure removed, ruling family executed, ordinary districts left to endure on new masters. The buried city created by human violence is therefore often not one dead place, but one identity crushed beneath the architecture of another. In the Bronze Age, Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, few cities reveal this more powerfully than Troy. On the mound of Hisarlik in northwestern Anatolia, successive settlements were built, damaged, destroyed, abandoned, and rebuilt over thousands of years. The famous city associated with the poems of the Trojan War is not a single exposed ruin, but part of a dense stack of urban lives. Massive walls from one phase survive beneath remains belonging to later inhabitants. Evidence of burning and destruction exists in more than one level. For generations, scholars argued over which archaeological Troy, if any, best matched the distant memory transformed into epic poetry. One late Bronze Age phase shows serious destruction around a period broadly compatible with an age of regional conflict, while a subsequent settlement also displays signs of violent ending, yet no excavation can produce Homer's heroes, a wooden horse, or 10-year siege as verified historical events. The poems preserve a cultural memory shaped by centuries of storytelling. What the mound proves is both more modest and more compelling. A strategically placed city near major routes was repeatedly worth building, fighting over, destroying, and rebuilding. Troy's layered survival exposes an uncomfortable fact. To later generations, a city's most famous destruction can overshadow every life that preceded or followed it. People who walked its streets before the legendary war, and those who repaired or reoccupied it afterward become supporting figures in a story they did not know they were living inside. And the archaeological mound contains households, storage, defensive labour, trade connections, food production, craft activity, fires, rebuilding, and the repeated insistence that this exposed place remained worth occupying. Human violence buried parts of Troy, but not forever in one decisive act. It made room for later Troys above earlier ones, until the city's ground itself became a record of repeated ambition and injury. Farther east, in the lands between rivers and empires, conquest could be recorded with horrifying clarity by rulers proud of causing it. Ancient Near Eastern kings often described captured cities as burned, demolished, plundered, turned into heaps, or made empty of inhabitants. Such phrases belong to the language of kingship. A victorious ruler demonstrated divine favour and military authority by showing that resistance led to ruin. The actual archaeological effects differed from case to case. But warfare repeatedly left cities damaged, populations displaced, and political landscapes reordered at Lachish in the Kingdom of Judah. Assyrian conquest in 701 BCE is preserved through an extraordinary combination of evidence. Excavation revealed signs of violent assault and destruction. Assyrian reliefs from the palace of King Sennacherib at Nineveh depict the siege in chilling visual detail, attacking forces, ramps, defenders, captives, booty, and punishment, all arranged to celebrate imperial power. The city's fall was not only a military event, it was turned into royal art, an official image of what happens when a fortified city resists the empire. The siege ramp at Lachish remains one of the most striking surviving features of ancient warfare. Attackers piled stone and earth against the city's defences to bring assault forces and siege equipment close enough to breach the walls. Defenders apparently reinforced threatened areas and fought back with whatever means remained. In the debris, archaeologists found arrowheads and slingstones, small objects whose concentration turns an abstract battle into an encounter fought at lethal range. A wall is no longer simply masonry, it becomes a place where people stood while projectiles struck around them, where the outcome would determine whether families within the city remained free, lived at all, or were carried away under imperial control. Lachish was captured and devastated, yet later occupation continued. The destruction layer records terror and defeat without claiming that human presence there ceased for all time. Other cities were less fortunate in the scale of their political destruction. Nineveh itself, capital of the Assyrian Empire and the source of reliefs glorifying conquered enemies, eventually suffered the fate its kings had imposed upon others. At its height, Nineveh was a centre of imperial administration, palaces, temples, walls, gardens, military power, archives, and wealth drawn from territories spanning much of the Near East. Its rulers had shaped cities across the region through siege, deportation, tribute, execution, rebuilding, and intimidation. In 612 BCE, a coalition including Babylonians and Medes attacked Nineveh. The imperial capital fell amid severe destruction, and the Assyrian state rapidly lost its central power. Palaces burned, reliefs collapsed, archives were buried. The city that had represented an almost overwhelming machinery of conquest became, in turn, a ruin beneath later earth. Yet fire at Nineveh preserved as well as destroyed. The palace library associated with Ashurbanipal contained thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform. When buildings burned and collapsed, tablets that might otherwise have been scattered, dissolved, or reused were baked hard in the heat and sealed beneath debris. Centuries later, the recovery transformed modern understanding of Mesopotamian literature, scholarship, omen interpretation, medicine, administration, royal correspondence, and myth. Among them were versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, including the famous flood narrative that startled 19th century readers when they recognized parallels with later biblical traditions. The burning of an imperial capital, intended by its attackers as destruction, unintentionally protected portions of a written world that would otherwise have been even more fragmentary. Human violence, like volcanoes, can preserve the very culture it tries to extinguish, though only in broken and accidental form. The destruction of cities also involved deliberate attacks on memory. Conquerors removed statues, smashed images of rulers, erased names, dismantled monuments, carried gods away as captives, and rebuilt sacred centres in the language of new power. A city was not only a collection of useful buildings, it was a claim about who belonged, which gods protected the land, which dynasty deserved obedience, and which past should be remembered. To defeat that claim, victors could transform the city's most meaningful spaces in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, Mesoamerica, the Roman world, and far beyond. Political change repeatedly altered inscriptions and images, reused temple stone, recarved monuments, or buried previous forms beneath later construction. Sometimes destruction was noisy statues broken in public, sanctuaries burned, walls battered. Sometimes it was quieter, a predecessor's name removed, a sacred site rededicated. An old palace quarried until its authority disappeared into new foundations. Carthage provides one of antiquity's most famous examples of a city defined by its enemies' account of destruction. Founded by Phoenician settlers on the North African coast, Carthage grew into a maritime power whose commerce, colonies, fleets, agriculture, and political influence brought it into prolonged conflict with Rome. After two major wars, the third ended in 146 BCE, with Roman forces capturing Carthage after a brutal siege. Ancient accounts describe house-to-house fighting, fire, mass death, enslavement, and systematic ruin. The later story that Romans sowed the site with salt is a much later embellishment rather than a reliably ancient fact, but the devastation itself was profound. A great rival city had been physically broken and politically removed. For Rome, its fall became proof that no Mediterranean competitor could stand against Roman persistence. But even Carthage did not remain empty forever. In time, Rome founded a new colony on or near the destroyed city's ground. Roman Carthage became a major city in its own right, prosperous and monumental, one of the important urban centres of Roman Africa. The conquered landscape was not ignored, it was appropriated. Roman streets, buildings, institutions, and identities occupied a place whose earlier Punic life had been violently severed. Excavating Carthage is therefore not simply uncovering a destroyed enemy beneath clean soil. It means disentangling Punic remains, Roman construction, later occupation, quarrying, erosion, modern development, and the distortions created by surviving written accounts that largely come through hostile or external observers. The city's burial is political in more than one sense. Its structures were covered by later building, and its memory was covered by narratives shaped by those who defeated it. Jerusalem offers another painful form of urban layering, because destruction returned repeatedly to a city whose sacred and political meaning made possession intensely contested. Babylonian forces captured and destroyed Jerusalem in the early 6th century BCE, burning major structures and bringing an end to the Kingdom of Judah, with deportation of part of its population. Centuries later, under Roman rule, the city again became the centre of revolt and catastrophic response. In 70 CE, Roman forces took Jerusalem after siege, destroying the Second Temple and devastating large parts of the city. Following further revolt in the 2nd century, Roman refounding and rebuilding imposed a new urban and political order. The same ground gathered ruins, sacred memory, rebuilt quarters, contested claims, mourning, and renewed settlement. Archaeological interpretation there is exceptionally sensitive and complex because later building, religious significance, political conflict, and deep historical attachment overlap within a living city. Still, the wider pattern is clear: a place can be buried by conquest without becoming forgotten, because loss itself can make a city more powerful in memory than it ever was in stone. Human destruction rarely operates alone. Armies burn a city already strained by famine. Siege spreads disease. Conquest interrupts canal maintenance, allowing fields to dry or flood after soldiers leave. Mass displacement removes the labour needed to repair roofs, clear drains, keep terraces stable, dredge waterways, and sustain worship. A city devastated by war may then be finished by weather, erosion, sand, vegetation, or later building, at some sites. The dramatic destruction layer receives attention because fire is visible in excavation, but the real ending occurs afterward, when survivors decide there is not enough security, food, authority, or hope to rebuild. A conquered city can die twice first when its defenders lose, and again when ordinary people no longer return. There are also cities deliberately buried not only by enemies but by their own successors. Rebuilding often means levelling earlier architecture, filling rooms with rubble, raising floors, extending platforms, sealing old shrines beneath renewed sacred buildings, or placing new palaces upon the remains of old authority. In many ancient societies, rebuilding a temple on the same site did not erase sanctity, it renewed it. Earlier phases could be intentionally enclosed inside later monuments, leaving archaeologists to peel back generations of construction in reverse. A city mound is therefore filled with acts of preservation that look like destruction, and acts of destruction that later become preservation. Walls knocked down to create a foundation may survive beneath that foundation far better than walls left exposed. A burned palace can protect clay archives. A defeated shrine buried beneath the victor's building can remain hidden until the victor's building is ruined in turn. This is why buried cities resist easy moral categories. Nature can kill without malice and preserve by accident. Human beings can destroy with intention and still inadvertently guard the evidence of what they sought to erase. The black layer of a burned city is terrible, but it is also readable. Charred grain reveals stores caught in crisis. Fallen weapons indicate struggle. Tablets baked in palace fires preserve messages never intended to survive an empire's end. Mass graves. Bodies beneath collapse. Hurriedly hidden valuables, damaged gates, and shattered sacred images expose the price paid by inhabitants whose city became a target. At the same time, caution remains essential. Not every broken statue marks hatred. Not every fire marks invasion. Not every abandoned house marks massacre. The evidence remains incomplete, and the dead cannot correct the stories later generations place upon them. Still, the ruins make one truth impossible to avoid. Cities are promises of continuity, and that is precisely why their destruction carries such force. A conqueror who burns a village destroys homes. A conqueror who burns a capital attempts to destroy a future, a political memory, a sacred map, a network of dependence, and the confidence that collective life can endure. Yet the buried layers repeatedly defeat complete erasure. Troy survives beneath later Troy. Lachish retains the stones of its siege ramp and the weapons of attack. Nineveh gives back tablets from burned palaces. Carthage remains beneath the city Rome later made on conquered ground. Jerusalem carries destruction inside a memory never surrendered. Human hands bury cities, but they rarely control what the buried city will say when it is found again. To hear those cities clearly requires more than fascination with flames, treasure, or legends of annihilation. It requires methods capable of distinguishing collapse from rebuilding, flood deposit from siege debris, looting from evacuation, royal propaganda from physical remains, and a famous ending from the thousands of ordinary days that gave the ending its weight, across ash fields, jungles, deserts, seabeds, and burned occupation layers. The buried world has to be recovered fragment by fragment, with brushes, maps, microscopes, scans, sediment cores, chemical traces, broken inscriptions, carbonized seeds, damaged bones, and the disciplined refusal to make the past say more than it can. The cities have been silent for centuries. The next mystery is how anyone learns to listen. A buried city does not speak in sentences, it speaks through relationships. A wall by itself is only a wall until someone notices the doorway sealed with rubble, the floor resurfaced after flood damage, the cooking vessel crushed beneath fallen roof tiles, the child's bead lodged in a drain, the blackened grain beside a storage jar, the skeleton lying where a staircase collapsed, the layer of ash above a street but below a later trench, dug by survivors returning for valuables. The past does not rise from the ground already arranged as a story. It emerges as thousands of small observations, each fragile, each incomplete, each capable of being misunderstood if removed from the place where it lay. For every city revealed in dramatic photographs, there are years of work spent determining what is ancient surface and what is later disturbance, which objects belong together, whether a deposit arrived in one violent event or accumulated gradually, and whether a silent room records normal life, hurried departure, death, scavenging, rebuilding, or several of these in sequence. The buried city is not a message waiting to be read. It is a damaged archive whose language has to be learned carefully, one layer at a time. Early excavators did not always treat ruins this way. The first generations drawn to ancient cities often searched for the striking and the collectible statues, inscriptions, painted walls, precious metals, royal tombs, carved reliefs, impressive vessels, objects worthy of museums or patrons. At Pompeii, tunneling into buried buildings began long before modern archaeological recording, sometimes removing art while leaving behind or destroying the evidence that explained how rooms had been used. Across the ancient world, treasure seekers, armies, landowners, antiquities dealers, travellers, and even serious scholars of earlier centuries cut through sites according to the priorities of their own time. A beautiful mosaic might be detached while a rubbish deposit full of food bones and broken household pottery was dismissed as unimportant. A royal inscription might be prized while the soil surrounding it, capable of revealing when and how it fell, was discarded. Much has been learned from those discoveries, but much was also lost because an artifact removed without context becomes like a word torn from a page whose surrounding sentences have been burned. Modern archaeology, at its best, begins with the understanding that the ordinary material is often the most revealing. A shattered cooking pot may show what people ate, how they stored food, where they acquired clay, whether trade continued during hardship, and whether a house was abandoned suddenly or cleaned out before departure. Animal bones can reveal diet, sacrifice, wealth differences, herding choices, famine responses, and butchery practices. Seeds and pollen can expose crops, weeds, garden plants, imported foods, local environments, drought stress, or changes in farming. Tiny fish bones in an inland city may show commercial connections invisible in monumental architecture. Insects preserved in deposits can suggest stored grain conditions, dampness, sanitation, or season of abandonment. Human waste, unpleasant as it may seem, can contain evidence of parasites and diet, bringing the physical realities of ancient health into sharper focus than royal texts ever could. A city is most truthful not always in the monuments it intended to preserve, but in the discarded material no one imagined would matter. Excavation is therefore an act of destruction performed in order to understand destruction. Once a layer of earth is removed, it cannot be put back exactly as it was. The archaeologist must record before revealing what lies beneath photographs, drawings, measurements, soil descriptions, samples, digital models, coordinates, notes on colour, texture, inclusions, wall relationships, floor levels, object positions, human remains, signs of heat, water, collapse, repair, or intrusion. A trench can descend through centuries in a few weeks, but only if each stage is documented well enough that later researchers can reconstruct what the excavation itself has removed. The finest object found without careful recording may be less valuable historically than a cluster of humble fragments mapped precisely on a floor. In a buried city, location is meaning. A coin in a street is one kind of clue, coins concealed beneath a threshold are another. A weapon displayed in a house differs from weapons concentrated near a breached gate. Charred wheat in a domestic jar differs from charred wheat packed inside a civic granary. The city speaks through patterns, and patterns disappear when objects are separated from their surroundings. At Pompeii, some of the most intimate discoveries came not from marble or bronze, but from absence. Organic bodies decayed within compacted volcanic material, leaving voids that could be filled with plaster, later with resin, or studied through scanning techniques. Furniture lost to decay sometimes left impressions or cavities. Garden roots disappeared, but their hollow traces allowed investigators to identify planting beds, orchard arrangements, vineyard rows, and domestic gardens once shaded by vegetation. By studying these spaces, archaeologists could move beyond the image of Pompeii as stone streets and tragic bodies to recover parts of its living landscape vines cultivated near the city, trees planted within courtyards, garden dining spaces, produce grown behind walls, flowers and shrubs arranged for scent, display, shade, ritual, or household use. An empty cavity in ash becomes evidence that catastrophe buried not only people and buildings, but the planted world through which daily pleasure and livelihood were organised. The casts of victims, so powerful to modern viewers, have also demanded changing methods and greater humility. Early plaster castings saved forms that would otherwise have vanished once excavators encountered the voids, but the results were sometimes displayed and described with dramatic certainty. A figure's posture became a complete emotional biography. A cluster of bodies became a family without sufficient proof. Jewellery or clothing encouraged assumptions about identity and status that may be plausible, but remain uncertain. More recent investigation can use imaging to examine bones and objects enclosed within casts, sometimes clarifying age, injuries, personal adornment, and the ways bodies were affected by collapse and volcanic deposits. Yet even improved science cannot recover final thoughts or restore names to most of the dead. The ethical weight of studying a buried city becomes clearest here. These remains are extraordinary evidence, but they are also individuals deprived of burial, exposed centuries later because the disaster that killed them made their bodies archaeologically visible. At Akrotiri, the absence of bodies leads to an entirely different kind of reasoning. Carefully excavated architecture, storage vessels, frescoes, furniture impressions, damaged stairways, and signs of preparation or evacuation suggest residents had warning before the final burial. But because the inhabitants are missing, archaeology must build understanding from what they chose or failed to take. Heavy jars remain. Easily transported valuables are rarer than might be expected. Rooms affected by earlier earthquakes indicate disruption before ash sealed the site. In such a place, emptiness is evidence, but dangerous evidence, and an occupied building does not tell whether its residents escaped safely, died elsewhere, returned briefly, or joined migrations invisible in the record. The town's silence prevents an emotionally satisfying conclusion. It teaches that careful study does not always close a mystery. Sometimes archaeology reveals exactly where certainty ends. In the Maya lowlands and at Angkor, the city cannot be understood only by opening trenches around temples. A monumental centre is only a fraction of the urban landscape that supported it. For a long time, dense vegetation made vast patterns difficult to perceive, reducing inhabited regions to famous stone peaks emerging from forest. Surveyors walked paths, mapped visible architecture, recorded carved monuments, and gradually expanded the known scale of settlement. Then airborne LiDAR altered the view. By sending laser pulses through gaps in canopy and measuring the ground surface below, researchers could create maps of subtle terrain hidden under trees' causeways, platforms, terraces, canals, defensive walls, reservoirs, residential mounds, roads, field systems, and grid-like patterns extending across areas once imagined as largely empty. It was not the discovery of cities previously unknown to all local memory, nor a magical reading of every structure's purpose. It was the recovery of scale. A royal pyramid no longer appeared isolated in wilderness. It stood within a worked, inhabited, organised landscape whose population had shaped nearly every useful surface around it. Remote sensing has made buried cities visible in deserts as well. Satellite imagery and aerial photography can reveal pale lines of former routes, rectilinear walls, ancient irrigation channels, field boundaries, mounds, fortifications, and structures hidden beneath light sand or difficult terrain. At places linked with caravan trade, routes may appear as braided traces converging on water sources or settlements. In Mesopotamia and Central Asia, ancient canals can sometimes be followed across dry plains long after fields they fed have vanished. Yet technology does not eliminate uncertainty. A visible line may be ancient, recent, natural, repaired across many periods, or unrelated to the theory that first drew attention to it. Ground survey, excavation, ceramics, dating, sediment study, and comparison with broader regional history remain essential. A satellite can reveal that something shaped the surface. It cannot alone identify the people who made it, the years it functioned, or whether its end came through war, water failure, abandonment, or shifting trade. Below the sea, even finding a city becomes an act of patient translation. Sonar and magnetometer surveys map anomalies beneath water and sediment. Divers descend into environments where one motion of a fin can cloud visibility, and where stone, timber, pottery, metal, marine growth, sand, and collapsed structure lie together under conditions entirely unlike dry excavation. Photogrammetry can assemble thousands of underwater images into detailed three-dimensional models of wrecks, walls, statues, and harbour spaces. At Thonis Heraclean, mapping the positions of temples, ships, anchors, inscriptions, ritual objects, monumental sculpture, and fallen architectural elements gradually restored the plan of a port whose streets could never simply be brushed clean and open to visitors. A colossal statue lifted from the seabed is visually spectacular, but its deepest meaning lies in where it fell, what sanctuary it belonged to, what inscriptions identify the city, what nearby vessels reveal about movement through its waters, and how its collapse relates to subsiding ground beneath the delta. Geology is one of archaeology's most necessary companions in cities buried by disaster. To understand Vesuvius, specialists read ash, pumice, surge deposits, roof collapse sequences, temperature effects, wind direction, and the physical behaviour of eruption columns. To understand drowned delta cities, they examine sediment, subsidence, faults, liquefaction, coastal change, river branches, and sea level history. In desert settlements, they trace ancient river courses, irrigation systems, dunes, soils, salinization, and the retreat of usable water. Around Angkor, sediments and canals and reservoirs help show erosion, maintenance, floods, droughts, and altered flow. In Maya regions, lake cores, cave deposits, soil records, charcoal, plant remains, and reservoir studies contribute to reconstructions of climate and land use. The buried city is never only an architectural site, it is an event within a landscape, and the landscape keeps records in grains of sand, layers of silt, mineral deposits, microscopic pollen, volcanic glass, water chemistry, and broken ground. Science can now draw information from traces almost invisible to earlier investigators. Residue analysis may identify wine, oil, animal fats, incense, fermented products, dyes, or medicinal substances once held in vessels. Isotopic study of human and animal remains can suggest diet, mobility, origins, and changing access to food. Ancient DNA, when preservation allows and ethical standards are respected, may illuminate biological relationships, disease, ancestry patterns, or movements of populations, though it cannot reduce cultural identity to genetics. Radiocarbon dating narrows timescales for organic material. Tree ring study can connect wooden beams or climate patterns with particular years. Volcanic material can link distant sites to the same eruption. Microscopic wear on tools reveals work performed by hands otherwise unrecorded. Even soot on a ceiling, mineral build-up inside a pipe. Or the repaired edge of a ceramic jar can add to the picture of how inhabitants managed life before burial. Written evidence can sharpen that picture, but also distort it if accepted too easily. An inscription celebrates a king, records attacks, names a temple, marks a tomb, or honours a benefactor, but it rarely records the full life of the city. Royal texts favour victory even in difficult times. Civic dedications present generosity rather than resentment over who paid for it. Religious decrees describe order, not every compromise involved in enforcing it. Graffiti, letters, receipts, legal tablets. Shipping records and household marks often carry different forms of truth, smaller in scale and closer to ordinary concern. At Nia, wooden tablets preserve disputes, animals, grain, obligation, and administration at an oasis settlement that would otherwise seem mute. At Nineveh, tablets sealed by destruction preserve a world of scholarship and imperial governance. At Pompeii, wall writing exposes campaigning, desire, insult, commerce, and casual presence. At Thonis Heracleon, a submerged decree settles a question of identity while revealing how trade revenue supported sacred institutions. Each text opens a window, but no text is the whole room. Conservation begins the moment discovery ends concealment. A wall painting protected beneath ash can deteriorate rapidly once exposed to air, moisture, sunlight, vibration, and visitors. Wood preserved underwater or in saturated mud may shrink, split, or collapse when removed unless treated over long periods. Carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum can crumble under physical handling, making non-invasive imaging essential if their hidden writing is ever to be recovered safely. Salt carried within stone from marine environments can crystallize after lifting and damaged surfaces. Desert textiles, vibrant when uncovered, may fade or disintegrate. Even uncovered streets suffer from rain, weeds, erosion, pollution, unstable masonry, theft, conflict, and the pressure of tourism. The paradox is severe to learn from a buried city. People must expose it. Exposure begins a new danger. Excavation is not rescue unless preservation follows, and preservation demands resources. Local partnership, careful management, and sometimes the difficult decision to leave parts of a site buried because burial still protects them better than display would. Nor are buried cities simply laboratories for outsiders. They sit within modern nations, communities, sacred landscapes, economic realities, histories of colonial removal, tourism, looting, war, displacement, and questions of who owns the past. Artifacts extracted in earlier eras often reside far from the places where they were found. Local people may depend on a site for income, worship near it, identify deeply with its legacy, or face restrictions imposed in the name of protecting ruins. Archaeology has not always respected those relationships. The study of vanished cities is most honest when it recognises that ancient disappearance does not make remains ownerless, and that uncovering history creates obligations toward living people as well as the dead. Even after every instrument has been used, much remains beyond recovery. Archaeologists may know which district burned, which canal failed, which foods were stored, which trade goods arrived, which year drought intensified, which statues fell, and which victims died beneath collapse. They may never know the argument in one household about whether to leave, the last route chosen by refugees from Akrotiri, the grief of survivors of Pompeii, the names of labourers who dredged Ankor's channels, the stories Maya migrants carried from emptied royal capitals, or the thoughts of sailors watching the quays of Thonis Heracleon sink into unreliability. The evidence remains incomplete not because investigation has failed, but because human life is always larger than what its material traces can preserve. And still, the fragments are enough to alter the silence. A buried city is no longer merely lost once its water system can be traced, its bread recognised, its drains mapped, its pigments stabilised, its ships measured, its drought scars identified, its burnt tablets read, its streets placed back into relation with homes and tombs and fields. It begins to speak not with one voice, but with many kinds of evidence agreeing, contradicting, and correcting one another. The city does not return alive. Its markets do not reopen, its lamps do not relight, and its absent people do not step from the excavation trench. But the landscape ceases to look empty. Beneath vines, waves, dunes, modern pavement, ash, or blackened rubble, the outline of human effort becomes visible again. That outline carries more than knowledge of the past. It exposes the choices cities continue to make in the present where to build, which hazards to tolerate, which infrastructure to maintain, whose safety to prioritise, how confidently to assume that water, weather, commerce, authority, and land will remain within familiar limits. The buried cities were not foolish because they were vulnerable. They were cities because they were vulnerable and still worth building. Their traces have survived as both achievement and warning, waiting beneath the surface of a world where many other streets, harbours, homes, libraries, temples, and workshops remain undiscovered, protected for now by darkness, sediment, roots, or the simple fact that no one yet knows where to look. Beneath the modern world, lost cities are not rare exceptions. They are part of the ground on which later lives continue. Beneath farmland lie walls reduced to faint lines in soil. Beneath crowded neighbourhoods lie roads older than the streets above them. Beneath harbours lie quays that once received ships carrying grain, perfume, timber, soldiers, pilgrims, and news from distant shores. Beneath deserts lie rooms still holding fragments of cloth and writing because moisture never reached them. Beneath forests lie reservoirs and causeways whose scale becomes visible only when technology removes the illusion of wilderness. Beneath the sea lie coastlines people once regarded as permanent. The buried city is not merely an archaeological curiosity, a sealed drama waiting to be uncovered. It is one of humanity's most persistent conditions. People build, adapt, endure, withdraw, destroy, rebuild, forget, and eventually discover that a landscape considered empty has been carrying an earlier arrangement of hopes all along. Many cities remain undiscovered because disappearance does not always leave a recognisable monument. A great stone temple may stand above vegetation or emerge from sand, drawing attention across centuries. Ordinary neighbourhoods are easier to miss. Houses made of mud brick or timber collapse into low rises. Farming flattens mounds. Later settlements reuse stone until little remains above ground. Floodplains bury walls beneath fresh sediment. Coastal water covers foundations without leaving any sign visible from land. In regions where war, poverty, political instability, or difficult terrain restrict fieldwork, whole archaeological landscapes remain only partly understood. Even well-known ancient cities are often only partly excavated, with most of their houses, workshops, streets, rubbish deposits, gardens, burial areas, industrial quarters, and surrounding settlements still protected or concealed below the surface. The famous revealed ruins are not the complete city. They are windows cut into something much larger. At Pompeii, visitors can walk along ancient streets and feel as though the city has already yielded itself entirely. Yet large areas remain unexcavated, and that restraint matters. Each uncovered building must be conserved against weather, plant growth, erosion, structural weakness, and the wear caused by those drawn to witness it. Leaving deposits sealed can be the most responsible way to preserve evidence until future methods allow more careful study. The buried city does not owe the present complete exposure. Its silence is sometimes protection. Rooms still enclosed by volcanic material may hold paintings brighter than those exposed generations ago, organic traces not yet damaged by air, and sequences of objects that can answer questions researchers have not yet learned to ask. Beneath the ash, Pompeii is not finished with history, it continues to wait. At Herculaneum, waiting has taken an even stranger form. The carbonized scrolls recovered from the Villa of the Peppery look at first like lumps of charcoal, their layers fused and fragile after exposure to volcanic heat. For centuries, attempts to open such rolls risked damaging or destroying the writing. Now advanced scanning and computational methods offer the possibility of reading ink hidden inside unopened scrolls, restoring text without physically unrolling the material that preserved it, only by becoming almost impossible to touch. Among those blackened rolls may be works known only by title, texts by authors otherwise lost, philosophical discussions copied for a household library before the eruption ended every expectation that anyone would read them again. A buried city can therefore conceal not only rooms and bodies, but thoughts, sentences held shut by catastrophe. Surviving at the edge of recoverability across nearly 2 millennia, Akrotiri continues to guard an even more personal unknown. Only part of the Bronze Age settlement has been exposed, and the missing inhabitants remain the central absence within its extraordinary preservation. Further excavation may reveal additional buildings, workshops, religious spaces, storage rooms, artworks, or evidence of preparation before the eruption. It might even find human remains, though nothing discovered so far has transformed the town into another Pompeii, more likely. The fate of its people will remain dispersed beyond the buried streets and coastal sites disturbed by waves, in settlements across the Aegean where refugees left no label identifying their origin, in changes in trade and pottery difficult to tie to individual human journeys. The city preserves its own evacuation more clearly than the lives that followed it. A painted wall can survive, a displaced family can merge into another community and disappear from archaeology almost completely. Within the forests of the Maya world, Lidar has already demonstrated how greatly estimates of settlement and infrastructure can change when the ground becomes visible beneath canopy. Yet even a precise map of platforms, terraces, reservoirs, roads, and defences is only the beginning. Each feature raises questions of date, use, population, hierarchy, labour, crop production, warfare, drought response, and abandonment. Entire regions will require generations of study before the pattern of urban growth and decline becomes clear. The same is true around Angkor, where immense mapped networks do not instantly tell who lived on each mound, how households shifted during environmental stress, or which canals failed first as population and political focus changed. New images of hidden cities do not end mystery, they enlarge it, because every newly seen road leads to more vanished decisions. In deserts, discovery can begin with a few dark marks on an image from above, a line where no modern road should be, a rectangular enclosure beside an ancient watercourse, a caravan stop half covered by dunes, or a cluster of mounds on a plain no longer irrigated. Climate and river history are essential here. A settlement now surrounded by emptiness may once have stood amid fields and orchards. Its present isolation created not by foolish builders, but by a waterway that wandered away centuries later. As arid landscapes are surveyed more closely, further Neolithic archives may appear documents, textiles, wooden structures, religious images, food residues, administrative records, and personal possessions guarded by the dryness that forced settlement to end. Yet such preservation is precarious: looting, development, erosion, shifting dunes, and changing environmental conditions can remove evidence rapidly once a site becomes known or disturbed. Beneath coastal waters, the unknown is greater still. When sea level rose after the Ice Age, it covered immense areas of former shoreline where people had gathered for freshwater, fishing, transport, shellfish, fertile ground, and movement between land and sea. Many of the earliest coastal communities in human history may now lie beneath shallow seas, their traces difficult to identify through sediment and marine activity. Later ports and cities are hidden there too, along river mouths, lagoons, deltas, islands, and subsiding shorelines. New surveys will almost certainly reveal more quays, settlements, shipwrecks, roads, temples, warehouses, cemeteries, and domestic structures. But the sea grants discoveries slowly. It preserves some material in darkness and silt while scattering or corroding other evidence beyond recognition. Each drowned site discovered also reminds the living that a coastline can hold memory of an older shore and the possibility of a future retreat. This is one reason buried cities carry a sharper relevance than ruined monuments alone. They are records of environments changing around human confidence. Rivers shift whether maps acknowledge it or not. Deltas sink under weight and water. Coastlines move. Volcanoes sleep longer than human memory and awaken without concern for property lines. Droughts expose the weakness of reservoirs and food systems designed around familiar seasons. Intense rains overwhelm infrastructure already strained by neglect or political fragmentation. Trade routes that once brought immense prosperity redirect themselves toward new technologies, powers, ports, or markets. Armies target the centres most certain of their importance. None of these forces belong only to antiquity. The methods have changed, the dependence has not. Modern cities are larger, more engineered, more connected, and in many cases better equipped to understand danger than ancient cities were. They have seismic monitoring, flood modelling, weather forecasting, evacuation planning, building codes, satellite observation, global supply chains, pumps, dams, emergency services, hospitals, digital records, and communication systems capable of spreading warnings at astonishing speed. Yet these strengths also create vast networks of reliance. Electricity requires generation and transmission. Clean water requires treatment and distribution. Food arrives through long logistical chains. Coastal districts concentrate enormous value on vulnerable ground. Roads, ports, railways, data centres, hospitals, sewage systems, fuel supplies, and housing are interwoven. A failure in one system can spread rapidly into others, just as a damaged canal or emptied reservoir once amplified stress within an ancient capital. The comparison must not be exaggerated. Modern cities are not destined to become Pompeii or Angkor. But the underlying lesson remains: complexity protects people only when it is maintained, trusted, adapted, and shared fairly enough to endure pressure. The buried cities also expose who suffers first when that protection fails. In catastrophe, not everyone has equal access to warning, transport, secure shelter, stored food, political influence, or the ability to abandon property and income. The remains of ancient cities rarely preserve social inequality with perfect clarity, but they show enough small dwellings beside opulent houses, ordinary bodies caught in danger. Workers and enslaved people supporting systems whose grandest monuments glorified someone else. Vulnerable communities left within failing landscapes as elites redirected power or escaped with resources. A city's final layer may bury everyone under the same ash or rubble, but its path toward disaster is usually uneven. The study of ancient urban loss is not merely a meditation on nature's power, it is an examination of decisions about repair, distribution, authority, warning, memory, and whose risk is considered acceptable while prosperity continues. There is another warning, quieter and perhaps more difficult to accept. Cities are not immortal simply because people love them. The inhabitants of every buried city had reasons to believe in continuation. Pompeii had survived earthquake damage and returned to commerce. Akrotiri possessed beautiful homes and sea connections. Maya courts stood in cities whose rulers inscribed themselves into sacred time. Angkor had shaped water and stone on an imperial scale. Merv had risen through dynasties and carried wealth across continents. Thonis Heracleon had joined Egypt to the Mediterranean under the protection of gods and officials. Carthage commanded maritime power until Rome resolved that it would not. Each place contained intelligence, skill, devotion, adaptation, and memory. None was saved by significance alone. And yet disappearance is not the same as failure. A city may be buried, but the people shaped by it do not always end with its streets. Survivors carry language, ritual, food ways, building knowledge, farming methods, crafts, beliefs, grief, names, stories, and habits of belonging into new landscapes. Maya people survived the decline of classic royal centres. Khmer life continued beyond Angkor's imperial transformation. Refugees and descendants carried memories beyond cities destroyed by conquest or disaster. The buried city is an ending for a particular concentration of life, not necessarily for the culture that made it. Even when names vanish, fragments move onward through people in ways archaeology can only partly see. What remains below, then, is not a collection of neat answers. It is an immense unfinished record. Somewhere, beneath a field that looks undisturbed, a doorway may still open onto a room abandoned in drought or war. Somewhere beneath a modern street, the stones of an older road may retain wheel marks from traffic forgotten by every written history. Somewhere beneath sediment, a ship may hold cargo from a port whose name has not survived. Somewhere inside an unopened scroll, a lost voice may be waiting for light that will never physically touch it. Somewhere under forest, a reservoir and a line of household platforms may change the estimated scale of a city thought already understood. Somewhere offshore, a drowned settlement may preserve the earliest evidence of families retreating from a rising sea. The cities buried forever were never truly outside the human story. They were the human story concentrated into walls and streets, the decision to settle where life seemed possible, the effort to manage risk, the confidence to build beautifully, the inequalities carried within prosperity, the shocks that reveal weakness, the courage and desperation of leaving, the long silence after abandonment, and the later desire to understand. Their ruins do not predict one fate for every city. They offer something more valuable than prophecy. They reveal that permanence is an achievement renewed daily, not a quality any civilization simply owns. A city lasts while people maintain the fragile agreements between water and stone, food and labour, memory and change, safety and ambition. Once those agreements break, even the busiest street can pass into darkness, waiting for strangers from another age to uncover the marks of lives that once considered it home. The last light of day settles gently over ruins. In Pompeii, it catches on uneven paving stones and enters rooms whose owners never saw another morning. At Akrotiri, painted swallows remain suspended above vanished households, still crossing walls beneath the knowledge of an island altered forever. In the Maya lowlands, rain gathers on leaves above stairways that once lifted rulers towards ceremony and crowds. At Angkor, water reflects towers built to resemble the centre of the universe. While channels stretch quietly through the plain like memories the earth has not quite erased. Across desert ruins, wind continues its steady passage through broken walls. Beneath the sea, fallen statues and timber ships rest in silt as sunlight breaks into moving fragments far above them. Nothing about these places is truly silent. Wind moves through them. Water changes them. Roots press into them. Visitors walk carefully over recovered stones. Researchers bend close to ash, clay, bone, pigment, pollen, wood, ink, and sediment. Yet the people who gave these places their urgency are gone, and no skill can restore the ordinary fullness of their days. The city can be mapped, dated, conserved, reconstructed in drawings and models, examined down to the smallest seed or grain of volcanic glass. Still missing is the feeling of returning through its gate with familiar burdens, knowing which corner held shade, which neighbour complained, which market seller cheated, which fountain ran cold, which temple festival drew a crowd, which window caught evening light. Perhaps that is why buried cities linger in the imagination. They do not appear empty in the way a landscape never settled can seem empty. They appear interrupted. Their doors suggest hands. Their stairs suggest footsteps. Their ovens suggest hunger soon to be answered. Their harbours suggest sails approaching from the horizon. Their reservoirs suggest a season people expected to survive, even after disaster, war, drought, subsidence, abandonment, and centuries of concealment. They retain the outline of expectation. Every living city carries that same expectation. Morning traffic begins, bread is delivered, water moves invisibly through pipes, lights appear behind windows, repairs are postponed or completed. People argue, trade, celebrate, grieve, hurry, rest, and plan for days they assume will come. Beneath that confidence lies the old bargain with land and time. No less real because modern walls rise higher and modern records fill servers instead of clay tablets. The buried cities ask for neither fear nor despair. They ask for attention. They remind the living that landscapes remember, that prosperity is never separate from care, that survival depends not only on building greatly but on adapting wisely, and that even after streets fall dark, traces of human effort can endure with extraordinary tenderness. And somewhere, under ash, roots, sand, silt, water, rubble, or the pavement of a city still alive tonight, an ancient threshold remains covered. No foot has crossed it for centuries. No lamp burns beyond it. Yet it is still there, holding its place in the earth, waiting in the deep patience of time,